Before he was a famed Confederate general, Patrick Cleburne was first an Irishman. In Ireland, he was born into a society in flux. The Irish Catholics were subjugated by the English and ranked below Irish Protestants on the social ladder. The Irish in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s existed in a tumultuous time and a poverty-stricken era for the island. A survey of one of the villages at that time showed that out of 9,000 inhabitants, there were only a total of 10 actual beds. Absentee English landlords used Irish tenant farmers to grow crops and could evict them and force them off the land as they saw fit. The Catholic were, for the most part, disenfranchised. The poor tenant farmers could only vote if they were paying an annual rent of 40 shillings. Also, if they voted for a Catholic, the candidate would have to swear under oath that he believed the invocation of the saints and the celebration of Mass were both superstitious and idolatrous. It was also illegal for Catholics to sit in Parliament at Westminster. The life of an Irishman was uncertain, and Patrick Cleburne was born into that society on March 16, 1828, in the rural Ovens Township. His father was a doctor, but by no means was he wealthy. However, his life was less uncertain because of his religion. About 20% of Ireland was Protestant, and the Cleburnes were part of that group. His mother, according to her parents, had married beneath her social status. Mary Ann Cleburne had been raised in a manor house and enjoyed a more affluent life than most Irish citizens. Her marriage to Dr. Joseph Cleburne had come with a dowry of £600, a wonderful supplement to the physician's medical practice. Before Patrick, Mary Ann and Joseph had 2 other children, William and Anne. In between the 3 siblings, she had 2 miscarriages. Although they lived in a rural area, the Cleburnes were still invested in the current politics arising in the cities, and when a candidate that supported the emancipation of Catholics to allow them equal political power to Protestants, Joseph Cleburne voted for that liberal candidate. The candidate's election sent shockwaves through Great Britain, and to hopefully avoid an uprising, Parliament passed the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. Although the Cleburnes were in a more affluent lifestyle, they still felt sympathy for those who were oppressed. The year after Patrick's birth, Mary Ann was pregnant again, being pregnant every year of her marriage thus far. She had had many complications associated with childbirth, but was able to birth a healthy boy named Joseph. After having the baby, complications arose, and she never recovered, dying in the fall of that year at the age of 37. The doctor, now with 4 children under the age of 5, hired a governess to look after the children, 18-year-old Isabella Jane Stewart. A year later, the 39-year-old doctor would marry the 19-year-old governess, and she would become the only mother Patrick would ever know. He called her Mama and asked her advice even into adulthood. The couple would have 4 children of their own, but one of Patrick's closest siblings was his sister Isabella, named after her mother. Patrick called her Izzy. In 1836, the Cleburnes would rise up the social and economic ladder when his father would lease a home called Grange House for £230 a year. The home was a 3-story Georgian house built around a 14th century country home that was itself built on the foundation of a 16th century abbey church. 2 tenant families came with the lease, and the rent from the tenants helped offset the annual lease payments. However, now the Cleburnes were members of one of the most despised communities in Irish society, the middlemen between the landlords and the tenant farmers. When Patrick was 12, his father sent him to Reverend William Spedding's Protestant school in Greenfield, about a mile away from their home, for about £50 a year. A large sum when the doctor was already stretched to pay his lease. However, Patrick's father wanted him to have an education. The Reverend created a strict regimen for his students, almost military-like, which may have began Patrick's interest in the military. Each December and June, before their vacations, the students would stand before the Reverend and 3 invited scholars, and the learned men would conduct oral exams. This was difficult for Patrick because he was generally shy in public. In 1843, tragedy struck the Cleburne family again. Patrick's father passed away from an illness at the age of 51. This halted Patrick's education. His older brother William came back to the estate to oversee its operation, and Patrick decided to leave the home to prevent being a financial burden on his family. He would apprentice with Dr. Thomas Justice. For room and board and an education in the medical field, Patrick would mix the doctor's powders, run errands, and assist the doctor with procedures. After only a year of apprenticeship, Patrick would submit an application to be a student at the Apothecaries' Hall in Dublin, but he was rejected twice. In the fall of 1845, some of the recently harvested potatoes began to show evidence of blight, brought on by a fungus that reduced the insides to a black mush. The Irish potato famine resulted in the starvation of thousands upon thousands of Irish. To relieve the starving Irish, Parliament funded works projects for the Irish to work by raising taxes on the landlords, and the more tenants a landlord possessed, the more taxes he had to pay. This contained two big flaws. One, the Irish didn't need money, they needed food. There was no food to buy in the first place. Two, the landlords, more often than not, would kick tenants off their land to avoid paying the taxes, which only exacerbated the problem. This sent the country into an economic downturn, and Patrick was directly impacted. Dr. Justice could no longer keep him as an apprentice, and the young Irishman could not go back home and put a financial strain on his family, so he decided to go to the Apothecaries' Hall in Dublin in person and plead his case. However, his lack of education in Latin and Greek forced the school to turn him down for a third time. Without anywhere to go, Patrick decided to join the army. He enlisted on February 27, 1846 in the British 41st Regiment of Foot, who were scheduled to return to India very soon. When he enlisted, he lied about his age, where he was from, and his occupation. He later said that he did this to prevent his family from knowing where he had gone, because he felt that he had disgraced them by not getting into the apothecary school. Instead of heading to India, the 41st became an army of occupation in Ireland, protecting the landlords from vengeful peasants, traveling all over the countryside, attempting to snuff out pockets of resistance. After 2 years in the army, he attained the rank of corporal, but he lost it very quickly. When the soldiers were called out to drill, instead of shouldering the 20-pound knapsack, he stuffed the knapsack with a pillow. He was horrified when the order came down to inspect knapsacks during drill. As Cleburne said, there was no help for it. The pillow was found, and I was a corporal no longer. The Cleburnes back at Grange House were desperate and decided that Ireland held no possibilities for them. But the United States did. They decided to immigrate. Izzy told her brother about the move, but when a soldier enlisted, it was usually for life. However, you could buy a discharge by paying back the monarchy for all they had provided for you as a soldier. As luck would have it, Patrick had turned 21, and he inherited his portion of his mother's dowry. He used it to pay off the discharge. He would later write, "I would now be a poor servile mercenary without a will or a thought of my own, in some soul-cramping fortress or barracks. I should at best in my old age hold the commission of a petty officer, detested by inferiors and looked down upon by superiors." He turned his back on the British Army and never looked back. By the end of 1849, Cleburne was aboard a ship with his brothers and sister, destined for the United States. One of his biographers said it most beautifully. The Patrick Cleburne who took passage for America in 1849 bore little resemblance to the 19th century stereotype of the bluff and hardy Irishman. He was cool and reserved, for life had taught him that it was not always a good idea to draw attention to oneself, but his ambition continued to burn. In Ireland, he had become intimately aware of how artificial barriers could kill ambition. Barriers against Catholics in public office, against young apprentices who could not read Latin, and against promotion into the officer corps from the ranks of the British Army. He was now going to a land where he believed few barriers existed. Quietly confident and fiercely ambitious, he eagerly looked forward to making his mark in America. Patrick Cleburne and his 3 siblings were on board the Bridgetown as it sailed across the Atlantic. On Christmas Day, 1849, he first spied his new country as his ship neared the mouth of the Mississippi River. They stopped over in New Orleans. His oldest brother had made prior arrangements for a job opportunity in the city. The others were destined for Ohio, where they had a cousin who lived there. He had wrote to them explaining the great opportunities available in that state, and they were determined to make a go of it there. William's job opportunity fell through, and all of the Cleburnes steamed up the Mississippi, then the Ohio to Cincinnati. That city was bustling with 115,000 inhabitants. Eventually, William would find railroad work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Joseph would move to Indiana. Anne would stay in Cincinnati and remain there the rest of her life. Initially, Patrick took a job as a clerk at a drugstore. It wasn't the well-paying job he hoped for, and he began looking for other opportunities. He was good at his job, and his employer had connections elsewhere. After a winter in Cincinnati, his employer introduced him to a Mr. Freeman who had just sold a drugstore to 2 doctors in Helena, Arkansas. The doctors were looking for a store manager, and Cleburne was eager to throw his hat in the ring for the job. Freeman set up the meeting, and the doctors and the Irishmen traveled down the Ohio and then the Mississippi, arriving in Helena on April 1, 1850. The town was considerably smaller than Cincinnati, with only 600 people. Dr. Charles Nash and Dr. Hector Grant were his employers, and they decided after a short trial period that Patrick was the man for the job. The new employee received a room above the store, which he shared with Dr. Nash, and he was paid $50 a month. The roommates became close friends, and Patrick helped Nash out in a couple of instances. At one point, a Mormon missionary arrived in town to gain converts. Nash organized a public protest against the missionary, and after being stopped from proselytizing, the Mormon entered the drugstore intent on harming Nash. Of course, Patrick was there, and when the man looked to be going for a pistol, the Irishman leaped across the counter and physically threw the man out of the store, warning him to never come back. Cleburne wanted to rise up the social ladder, but he had two drawbacks. He was painfully shy, especially around women, and he was Irish. The Irish suffered from harassment and prejudices, especially in this period of American history. Newspapers regularly ran funny anecdotes featuring knave or dumb Irish characters in between their news stories. If Cleburne was to achieve success, he was going to have to overcome these obstacles. It didn't help that he had a stereotypical Irish name of Pat or Patrick. Joe Maxey was Nash and Grant's apprentice. Needless to say, Joe and Patrick spent a lot of time together. In the fall, when the harvest was coming in, Cleburne spied something that he had never seen before, a large green fruit. He asked Maxey what was it. The apprentice explained it was a watermelon, and it was delicious and that he should buy one. The excited Irishman purchased the fruit and then asked Maxey how to prepare it. Maxey saw his opening to have a laugh and told him he needed to stew it. So Cleburne got out a brass kettle and cut up the watermelon into the kettle of water and brought it to a boil. When the doctors came to the store, Patrick was proud of his new dish and served it to them on a plate with spoons as per Maxey's instruction. Joe couldn't take it any longer and busted out laughing, and when the situation was explained to Cleburne, he chased after Joe, who was running out of the store to get away from the angry Irishman. He had a lot to learn as a new immigrant. He learned to ride, hunt, and even fight. However, there was one thing he did not do, and that was drink. He attempted to drink socially with his associates, but found that alcohol made him angry, and at one point he came close to killing his best friend and employer, Dr. Nash. After that episode, he became a teetotaler and abstained from alcohol. Another factor that kept him from drinking was he didn't want to become the stereotypical drunk Irishman that many of his countrymen were characterized as in this period. In April 1851, Nash would marry Grant's sister-in-law and move out of the store. Cleburne would move out as well in December 1851. Grant wanted to sell his portion of the store. This was Patrick's chance to rise up financially and economically. He put down a $350 down payment, and he would pay off the balance of the $1,150 over the course of the next year. He was now an entrepreneur. In the fall of 1852, a fire consumed most of the town and destroyed a lot of the store, and the merchandise that was saved was ruined by a driving rain that put out the fire. Nevertheless, he and Nash rebuilt, and their business went on. Cleburne quickly entered into Helena's political elite. He attended the Episcopal Church, joined the literary club where he read books about history and biographies, and joined the debating society where he rubbed elbows with the town's lawyers and politicians. He formed a chess club and became its president, and then sought membership in the Masonic Lodge. He rose through the ranks of the Masons and was conferred a Royal Archmason by Albert Pike. Even with his success, he still wasn't in the upper echelons of the area. The social circles of the cotton aristocracy were growing considerably. Grant and Nash owned plantations, not just to enter the social circle, but it was lucrative. Even the lowliest yeoman farmer grew a small amount of cotton because the cotton market was booming. Cleburne would not join that group. Some have pointed to this as evidence that he didn't like slavery, but most historians point to another reason he didn't invest in cotton and slavery. Because it was a boom economy, it was expensive to enter into that life, and Cleburne didn't have that kind of money available to him. One of his biographers stated, "Nowhere in his few surviving papers from this era is there any reference to his views on slavery. Most likely he did not think about it one way or the other. Slavery was an inherent part of society that he sought to join, one more American curiosity to be noted and acknowledged." Even as the part owner and manager of the drugstore, he was not content. He wanted to rise up higher on the social ladder, and the law looked to be his inroad. In April 1854, he and Nash sold their shares of the business, and Cleburne pocketed $3,000. He planned on living off that money while preparing for the bar. He studied under the law practice of Hanley and Alexander on Elm Street in Helena. He got along well with his partners, him and Hanley especially. Thomas Hanley, the senior partner, was an avid reader and studier of history and was a big fan of Napoleon. Cleburne, coming from the English side of the Napoleonic Wars, favored Wellington, so it was common to find the two wrapped in a war of words addressing who was the better commander. In the summer of 1854, Cleburne's life would change when a barely 5-foot-tall man named Thomas C. Heineman entered Helena. The hot-tempered lawyer from Mississippi who had passed the bar in Mississippi at the age of 23 and achieved the rank of colonel in the Mexican-American War made quite the impression on the Irishman. During the 4th of July celebrations, Heineman was asked to deliver a speech on behalf of the Democrats. Each political party made speeches, and after the roaring speech by Heineman, a prominent Whig confronted the small man and they had a pull-apart. They decided that a duel would need to be fought to settle the matter. The men chose bowie knives as their weapons, but their seconds wanted to avoid bloodshed and enlisted the help of Cleburne to mediate the discussion between the two men. He was able to calm the situation down. As his biographer stated, Heineman and Cleburne became not only friends, but close political associates. Cleburne, the shy and reserved lifelong Whig, became the lieutenant of Heineman, the fire-breathing Democrat and street brawler. One reason that Cleburne changed political parties, although it could be said he had never been fully invested in politics as a Whig, was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The whole political scene in the United States was in flux in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The Whig Party was dying away and two new parties were emerging, the Know-Nothings or the American Party and the Republican Party. This left Cleburne without a political home. He could not join the Know-Nothings because their political platform was based around the idea that the biggest threat to American society was immigrants, specifically German and Irish immigrants. They wanted to limit the rights of immigrants and make it more difficult to become citizens. There was only one party he could join in the 1850s in Arkansas, and that was the Democratic Party. Heineman organized a rally and was to deliver the principal address, but when his father passed away, he left for the funeral, leaving the shy Cleburne to make the speech. The Irishman made 3 points. 1, and this he borrowed from his own father's philosophy, that it was unwise, unjust, and unconstitutional to bar Catholics from the government. 2, that legislation aimed to attack all foreigners was unconstitutional. And 3, that the Know-Nothing cause was a front for abolitionists. Numerous scholars have debated this third point as being his own or Heineman's choice. Again, Cleburne had made no personal mention about slavery in the documents that have survived, and many believe he was indifferent to the matter. However, the choice of his political party and his role as the head of the Democratic Association placed him in a position to support that platform. In September 1855, a yellow fever epidemic visited Helena. For those who could leave, they did, but 3 doctors stayed to take care of the ailing population, Nash, Grant, and one other. Cleburne and Heineman also stayed behind to help the doctors by preparing meals, carried water, and gave any support they could to the doctors and patients. Soon the epidemic passed and Cleburne went back to studying for the bar. In December 1855, Hanley became a judge on the Arkansas Supreme Court, and the next month, Cleburne was admitted to the Arkansas bar and became partners with Alexander. Soon after, he invested the rest of his savings along with Heineman into buying the Democratic Star newspaper and renamed it the States' Rights Democrat. His political career brought with it an increased danger because of how frontier politics was hashed out. In May 1856, Heineman approached Cleburne and told him to arm himself and to join him for dinner at a local hotel. Heineman thought that a political opponent would attack him because Heineman had called him a mulatto for changing political parties from a Democrat to a Know-Nothing. Dorsey Rice, the offended party, and 2 other men approached Heineman and Cleburne in the street as they walked to the hotel. A series of verbal abuse let loose from both sides, and Rice pulled his pistol and fired it at Heineman. The bullet grazed Heineman's arm and hit him in the chest. Another associate of Rice pulled his gun and fired at Cleburne, hitting him in the chest. Cleburne responded by pulling both of his pistols and firing into the group. He hit Rice's brother-in-law, James Marriott. Heineman recovered quickly, but Cleburne and Marriott's wounds appeared mortal. Cleburne was carried to a room above a dry goods store where Nash stayed with him. The bullet had passed through his right lung and lodged against his spine. It was in such a delicate place that Nash was scared to operate until the patient was stronger. After 3 days, Marriott had died in immense agony. After a week, the bullet was safely removed, but Cleburne never fully recovered. He would write to his brother that, "My lungs have never been well since I was wounded. I catch cold on the smallest provocation, and an hour's excited debate in the courthouse will sometimes fill my mouth with blood. A grand jury exonerated the two Democrats for their action in the gunfight, and they refused to press charges against Rice. Cleburne always felt uneasiness and guilt for killing Marriott, especially since the man he killed had not fired a shot but did have his gun drawn. After the presidential election of 1856, Cleburne left local politics when his candidate won the presidency, James Buchanan. Even his newspaper ceased publication. Heinemann would be elected to Congress in 1858 and pushed for expanding the institution of slavery into Central America and pushing for more support for the Fugitive Slave Act. Cleburne would be Heinemann's best man in his wedding, but would stop being his close acolyte. Cleburne went back to practicing law, although he had to do so independently when his partner became a circuit court judge. Patrick would dip his toe into railroad construction, but mostly deal in settling disputed land claims. He would eventually partner up with Barry Scaife and Learned H. Mangum. The Irishman, after 10 years in the country, had risen up the social ladder and secured his place in Helena as a successful lawyer and respectable citizen. However, as his life was coming together, the country was beginning to tear itself apart. In April 1860, Cleburne, although not very politically active, would still serve as a delegate to the State Democratic Convention in Little Rock, Arkansas. His friend Thomas Heinemann would sponsor a resolution requiring Arkansas delegates to leave the National Convention in protest unless the party adopted a platform plank for a national slave code. When the Democratic Party met in Charleston, South Carolina for their National Convention, Northern Democrats refused any such plank, and many of the Southern Democrats walked out, including half of the Arkansas delegates. Southern Democrats met in Richmond, Virginia, and chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky as their candidate, and Northern Democrats met in Baltimore, Maryland, and chose Stephen Douglas as their candidate. The Republicans would choose Abraham Lincoln, and a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. On Election Day 1860, Cleburne cast his ballot for Breckinridge, but Abraham Lincoln would be elected president. Heinemann would urge for secession of the southern states, but Cleburne was obviously torn. During the secession winter, Cleburne wrote to his brother Robert, living in Newport, Kentucky, that, "I never spent a more gloomy Christmas. My partners were participating in gaieties I did not feel like sharing. I have been invited to 20 parties this Christmas and have not attended one. I hardly know what to say to you about politics. The fever of revolution is very contagious. My own opinion is that the first bloodshed on Southern soil and a collision between federal troops and the state authorities of any Southern state will be the signal for civil war." Cleburne hoped that the Union could be preserved, but only if the federal government proved willing to grant the South what he called the full measure of her constitutional rights. If that could not be met, he stated that he hoped to see all the Southern states united in a new confederation, that we can effect a peaceable separation. He considered himself a son of Arkansas and stated to his brother that these people have been my friends and have stood up for me on all occasions. He concluded that I am with Arkansas in weal or woe. He and his brothers were products of their location. William in Wisconsin and Joseph in Indiana were for Lincoln. Robert in Kentucky just hoped his state could survive a precarious neutrality, and Patrick was a states' rights Democrat. Each one reflected the society in which they lived. The summer of 1860 saw Cleburne help form the Yale Rifles, named after former Governor Archibald Yale, who had been killed at the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican War. 115 volunteers joined the group, and they elected Cleburne their captain, presumably because of his 3.5 years in the British Army. Since Cleburne had been in the United States, he had saw the disadvantages that Irish immigrants had in the country. He attempted to rid himself of his Irish accent. However, during his time drilling his volunteers in the Yale Rifles, his Irish roots were exposed. As he bellowed forth commands, he would let words slip into an Irish brogue, and his troops took notice of it. Although shy and bashful around women, and initially shy in any public forum, Cleburne had developed into a good public speaker when addressing his men at lodge meetings, political rallies, and on the drill field. In early 1861, a rumor spread throughout the state that federal troops were on their way to support a federal arsenal in Little Rock. This caused many civic leaders to reach out to the governor and offer their militias to the cause. Through a series of miscommunications, the civic leaders believed the governor to be asking for support when he actually wasn't, and began sending their militia companies. Cleburne's Yale Rifles steamed down the Mississippi, then up the Arkansas River to Little Rock, where they arrived on February 5th. Soon, nearly 1,000 militiamen of various discipline descended upon Little Rock, causing great concern to its citizens. The governor, a little concerned, but also seeing an opportunity, sent a message to the commander of the arsenal informing him that he could not control the growing numbers of troops in the city and urged him to turn over the arsenal to state authorities. On February 8th, he did just that, and the militias returned to their locales. As Arkansas seceded and mobilized for war following the firing on Fort Sumter and Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, they sought to arm their militias and ordered rifles and ammunition from northern dealers. One of the ships carrying Helena's order was stopped and detained by city officials in Cincinnati, Ohio. Irate, Helena's officials ordered the first Cincinnati-owned ship that passed by on the Mississippi River to be captured. The ship, the Queen of the West, a Cincinnati-owned vessel, had a cannonball shot across its bow, and it halted, and Helena captured it. However, the owner of the ship was Thomas Sherlock, the brother of the man who married Cleburne's sister. Patrick made a passionate speech to the city leaders, where he wept and asked them to release the ship. They relented, and the ship went on its way. A few days later, Cleburne and the Yale Rifles left their homes in Helena to join the war. They steamed up the Mississippi to an open plain a few miles north of Memphis on the west bank of the river, designated Camp Rector after the governor of Arkansas. There, the companies were formed into regiments, and those regiments elected their colonel. The Yale Rifles were placed in the 1st Arkansas Volunteer Infantry, and they elected Cleburne their colonel without opposition on May 8, 1861. Although the regiment chose their own officers, generals in the state armed forces would be chosen by a 3-man military board chaired by the governor. They created 3 generals, 1 major general and 2 brigadier generals. The brigadier general who took command of the forces at Camp Rector was Thomas H. Bradley, a 65-year-old Southern planter and a Union man until the last moment, who had no military experience. When Bradley arrived at Camp Rector, he was met with derision from many of the troops who did not fancy the idea of serving under him. Cleburne reported to Bradley, and barely a week as commander went by before he ordered a reconnaissance in force toward Bearsville Point, where unverified rumors of Yankees were said to be. He ordered Cleburne's 1st Arkansas to lead the advance. Bradley hadn't ordered enough supplies, the route seemed random, and when the troops found nothing, he failed to recall an advance scouting party and essentially abandoned them. And the quick recall of Cleburne's force forced them to abandon supplies that were carried to that point. Once the Arkansas troops returned to Camp Rector, the men from Arkansas urged Cleburne to do something, and Cleburne viewed Bradley as a threat to the safety of his men. Patrick would post a guard at Bradley's headquarters, basically putting him under arrest. He sent word to his friend Judge Hanley that Arkansas forces returned from Bearsfield Point between 2 suns, a quantity of material abandoned, scouting party picked of men abandoned, no enemy nearer than Cairo, we are the laughingstock of the Tennesseans. He hoped his friend would take his actions to the military board and represent them accurately. What Cleburne had done was a mutiny. He allowed Bradley to leave Camp Rector, and the displaced commander went straight to Little Rock and wanted Cleburne and 5 others brought up on the charge of mutiny. The court-martial failed to take place. For one reason, Bradley was afraid that an inquiry would expose his incompetence and he would resign his commission in humiliation. Although it turned out to be okay for the Irishman, it was a close call to fight back against a superior like he had. Soon, the provisional president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, ordered General William J. Hardee to take over command of all troops north of the Arkansas River and west of the White and Black Rivers. This would begin a strong friendship between Hardee and Cleburne. Patrick admired Hardee's military decorum and confidence, and Hardee appreciated Cleburne's attentiveness to his troops. They became very close friends. Another reason that Hardee liked Cleburne was because he had the best drilled soldiers under his command. Cleburne ran a strict drill, and he was present and commanded all of the drills himself. His men hated the constant manual of arms instructions, but respected Cleburne for being with them through it all. Cleburne also had a unique punishment for minor infractions. He had the man carry a rail for a mile. Every soldier knew what was about to transpire when the wooden rail was called for and given to a poor man. By August, Hardee and Cleburne had moved their troops in southeastern Missouri in coordination with Gideon Pillow's push towards St. Louis. The campaign ground to a halt when Pillow became cautious to the point of inaction. In the second week of August, it looked like Cleburne was going to get his first taste of battle. Union troops were supposedly on the road toward the Irishman's position. He had the 1st Arkansas and a single cannon. When he ordered the artillery forward, he found that the crew had went into the house of a woman whose husband was serving in the Confederate Army and plundered her house. A rider approached Cleburne and informed him that the enemy was approaching. The captain of the gun asked that his men be released so they could man the gun, but Cleburne said in a loud, clear voice that his men expected to fill honorable graves and not to rest side by side with thieves. It was a moment that many troops who heard it would remember because it had a moral effect on the troops. Despite his preparedness, the blue troops never made their appearance. The town hall was used as Hardee's and Cleburne's headquarters. It was also used as a prison for a handful of Federal soldiers. The lieutenant who had brought in the prisoners was also tasked with guarding them. In the night, Cleburne was awakened by the yells that the prisoners were escaping. He grabbed his pistol and stepped out of his room to see a figure running down the hallway. He leveled his pistol and fired. When he went over to the man, he found that it was the lieutenant. The young man had dreamed that the prisoners were escaping, and had half asleep ran down the hallway shouting. Cleburne asked the man to forgive him. The lieutenant granted it, but would die. The first man Cleburne killed during the war was a fellow officer. Hardee and Cleburne left Missouri and traveled to Bowling Green, Kentucky, where Confederate Commander Albert Sidney Johnston was located, part of a defensive line that ran from Columbus, Kentucky to Bowling Green and then to Cumberland Gap. At Bowling Green, Cleburne became a brigade commander. He commanded the 1st and 5th Arkansas, the 6th Mississippi, and the 5th Tennessee. While at Bowling Green, word reached Hardee and Johnston that Federal troops were occupying Jamestown, Kentucky. They sent Cleburne and his brigade to investigate, but all he found was a few cavalry that he drove off easily. He noticed that every town he passed through was nearly abandoned, scared of the Confederate Army, so he decided to attempt to convince the citizens of that part of Kentucky that they had nothing to fear. If they found belongings or luggage from citizens trying to hide their valuables, or had left their baggage in a hasty retreat out of the area, Cleburne ordered it to be returned to the nearest house with a note saying, "Returned by Southern soldiers." The brigade returned to Bowling Green, having found no major Federal troops. It was now November, and the next few months would consist of many setbacks for the Confederacy. In January, a Confederate force would be defeated at Mill Springs, and in February, the two forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, would fall to Union forces, forcing Johnston to pull his troops further south. By March, Cleburne and his men were at Shelbyville, Tennessee. On the 4th of that month, Cleburne would be made a brigadier general, yet he had not participated in any major battle. However, that soon would change. Confederate Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard assembled a nearly 40,000-man force near Corinth, Mississippi, of which Cleburne was a part of. His brigade had grown. His own 1st Arkansas got renamed the 15th Arkansas, and the rest of his brigade was made up of Tennesseans and Mississippians. The 6th Mississippi, 2nd, 35th, 23rd, and 24th Tennessee. Cleburne protested the name change, but the 1st Arkansas title went to another unit. As the conglomeration of troops emerged from its encampment around Corinth, Mississippi, Hardee's Corps, which included Cleburne, was to take the lead in the advance on the Federals amassing at Pittsburgh Landing. At the end of the first day, Cleburne ordered his men to bivouac around a cool spring where the men could gather water and be prepared to move out the next day. Cleburne delivered some personal speeches to each regiment about the next 24 hours and bedded down for the night. He was supposed to resume his advance in the lead the next day, but found that Polk's corps had camped beside the road and prevented his troops from moving. Polk's men sluggishly moved to the side, and Cleburne and the rest of Hardee's corps proceeded toward the landing. The Confederates marched so close to the Federal encampments that they could hear the bugles and drums from the Union soldiers preparing for morning drill. It would be Cleburne's men who encountered Federal cavalry and threw them back. This occurrence and others convinced Beauregard that the element of surprise had been lost, but Johnston wanted to continue with the plan to turn the Federal Army away from the Tennessee River and destroy them. Cleburne's brigade sat and waited. Orders would arrive to form up, and then another set of orders would arrive to tell them to stand down. The Confederate Army was having a difficult time assembling for an attack. Some commanders described it as chaos, as regiments attempting to align themselves in the correct location. Cleburne's brigade had arrived first and had been in their assigned spot for a long time, waiting for their comrades to form. On the morning of April 6th, after 2 nights of sleeping on the damp ground, Cleburne ordered his men forward to launch the attack that would begin the Battle of Shiloh. Because he knew that coordination with the brigades to his right were of the utmost importance, He placed himself between the two regiments on the extreme right, the 6th Mississippi and the 23rd Tennessee. Almost immediately, he and his men encountered an obstacle, the Shiloh Branch. It had swollen from the previous rains, and what was left was a swampy area. As Cleburne urged his horse through the muddy terrain, the horse became spooked and threw the Irishman. He landed in the mud, but he was unhurt. He remounted and resolved that he would have to go around the swamp. The 6th Mississippi and the 23rd Tennessee went off to the right with Cleburne, and the rest of the brigade moved to the left. His brigade's punching power had been diminished, and the blue troops of William Tecumseh Sherman awaited him. After a couple of charges which battered both regiments, eliminating both regimental commanders, Cleburne then rode off to the left, but those regiments were pinned down by a murderous fire from the enemy troops in their front. Seeing that he could do nothing in that sector, he rode back to the right. He then formed the remnants of the two regiments and assaulted the position. This time, because the regiments to his right had successfully turned the Union flank, the blue troops gave way. Again, he traversed the battlefield to see how his troops on the left were doing. He ordered what was left of his regiments to proceed forward, and the men obeyed. They ran into a line of blue troops and fired away for about 30 minutes until the enemy line gave way. Cleburne wanted to pursue, but his men were out of ammunition. So he halted the regiments, and select men were chosen to carry ammunition boxes on their backs over a mile to the regiment, and once it was distributed, Cleburne advanced his brigade. The brigade numbered around 600 men. The casualties piled up in his regiments and continued to do so as the Irishman moved his troops forward. It was about dusk when he received word that Johnston had been killed and Beauregard had ordered a halt. Cleburne found an empty Federal tent and attempted to sleep, but the Federal gunboats launched shells into their midst during the hard rain. The explosive shells killed the wounded of both sides. Cleburne later wrote that history records few instances of more reckless inhumanity than this. By the morning, the brigade had about 800 effective men. The slightly wounded and men that lost contact with their companies had filled some of the ranks, but it was a far cry from the 2,700 that Cleburne began with. Rumors and orders came to him informing the brigade commander that Federals were advancing, and he formed up. The Confederate units were scattered from the hectic advance of the day before, and Cleburne felt around blind to find another battle line to join. He found elements of Breckinridge's men, and he extended that line to the left. He could see Federals moving around to the left of his line about that same time, and orders came from General Bragg that an advance was to be made. He informed the adjutant that an advance would threaten the entire battle line, but the writer told him it was an order and he had to obey it. The Confederate line pressed onward through a dense smoke and forest. Cleburne would write, "I could not see what was going on to my right or left, but my men were dropping all around before the fire of an unseen foe." This type of attack could not be sustained for long, and a general withdrawal was ordered. Cleburne harbored animosity for Bragg, who had ordered such an attack. As the Confederates retreated, Cleburne's brigade, now reduced to about 60 men due to the confusion of the withdrawal, which only left him with the remnants of the 15th Arkansas to command, was to act as the rear guard. He performed his duty well, but he was hindered by what he could do because of his small force. All in all, his brigade had lost 1,043 killed, wounded, and missing out of 2,750, nearly 38%, and the 6th Mississippi sustained one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. The maimed army meandered its way south to Corinth. Cleburne, mounted on his horse with a captured sack of Yankee cornmeal around the pommel of his saddle, gnawed on a piece of Yankee hardtack softened by rainwater. Often the Irishman fell asleep in the saddle, only to be awakened by a lightning strike and thunder. The Confederate army that encamped around Corinth was disheartened. Just a week before, they looked on the coming battle with hope and vigor, but now it was a bad memory filled with death of their comrades. Stragglers slowly trickled into their ranks, but the 15th Arkansas was so decimated that it was consolidated with the 13th Arkansas from Stewart's brigade. Lucius Polk, the nephew of Leonidas Polk, took command of the regiment after the death of their colonel at Shiloh. This first major battle of Cleburne's career led him to realizing something important about the fight around Shiloh Church. It had not been a Napoleonic-style battle as much as men hiding behind trees and taking on a more irregular style of warfare. Therefore, he proposed a new organization for his brigade. He wanted the 5 best shots from each company to be organized into a couple of separate companies. that could be deployed as skirmishers to significantly weaken the enemy before the main line was reached and to eliminate artillerymen from a distance so that the rest of the brigade would proceed unimpeded by cannon fire. It was also at Corinth that Cleburne got to exercise independent command. Federal forces were moving at a glacial pace against the Confederate forces entrenched in northern Mississippi. When they got close, Cleburne was sent on a reconnaissance mission along with the newly arrived General Earl Van Dorn. Cleburne was to investigate the Shelton House, presumed to be abandoned. He accompanied the 35th Tennessee and ordered the other regiments to come up on his flank to approach the house. He waited a sufficient amount of time to allow the 24th Tennessee to follow orders and sent in the 35th. When they made it to the house, nearly an entire Union division met them. Cleburne looked around and didn't see the 24th. As the 35th got stuck in a fight for their lives, Cleburne tried to find the other regiment. He found it and its commander, with his jacket off, complaining that the foliage was too thick to maneuver his regiment. The Irishman's blood boiled, and he finally got all of his men and prepared for an assault. The 24th being already badly maimed, but before he could launch a charge, word came from Hardee to call off the attack. It was a good thing too, because Van Dorn, who was supposed to find the Union flank, had gotten lost and wasn't going to give Cleburne any support. The situation at Corinth was dire. The bad drinking water and unhealthiness of the camps were threatening the integrity of the army, so Beauregard moved out in late May to the southwest. By June, the army was in Tupelo, and while there, Beauregard informed President Davis that he was heading to Bladden Springs in southern Alabama for his health. After 3 days and before Davis could reply, Beauregard left for Alabama. Davis was irate and charged him with abandoning his responsibilities and placed Braxton Bragg in command of the army. It was June and the height of the campaign season. Bragg contemplated an attack on Corinth, but decided against it. General Edmund Kirby Smith in the Department of East Tennessee proposed an invasion of Kentucky, and Bragg agreed. The Army of the Mississippi began moving out of Tupelo, Cleburne's brigade being one of the last to leave. They traveled by rail to Meridian, then Mobile along the coast, where they left the train and got on a steamboat that took them across the Pearl River to another train. From there they traveled by rail to Montgomery, then to Atlanta, and finally arriving at Chattanooga on August 1st, 1862. While traveling to Chattanooga, Bragg and Smith sat down and ironed out the details. Bragg agreed to give Smith reinforcements, those under Preston Smith and Patrick Cleburne. Cleburne boarded another train and set off for Knoxville, arriving on August 7th. Kirby Smith reorganized his department with his new troops and combined Preston Smith and Cleburne's brigades into one division, naming Cleburne as the acting divisional commander. Before long, the whole Army of East Tennessee with Cleburne bypassed the Union-held Cumberland Gap to the west and invaded Kentucky. After a stopover at the small community of Barberville, Kentucky, Cleburne led the way north to Richmond, Kentucky. On August 29th, Confederate cavalry reported they had set up a picket line, but that Federals were in strength ahead. Cleburne formed his men into battle line, facing the unseen threat. All of a sudden, the Confederate cavalry, wagons, and servants leading horses came barreling down the road toward Cleburne with Federal cavalry nipping at their heels. Cleburne had his men exit the road and concealed themselves on the side of the thoroughfare. When the enemy got to within 25 yards, the Confederate infantry fired a surprising volley into the Blue Horsemen, and after a brief standoff, the Federals retreated. The next day, Cleburne was ordered to attack the Federals at an early hour. The Irishman did as he was told and soon found the enemy. Instead of launching an assault, he sent out his select sharpshooters to play havoc on the Union artillerymen. The casualties mounted, and the Union commander decided to launch an attack to relieve pressure on his cannon crews. He attacked Cleburne's right flank, but Patrick easily secured it, knowing that the Federals had to send troops from other parts of their line to launch that attack. He thought the enemy might be weakened, and he called up Preston Smith's brigade to form on his right, and he would assault the enemy. As he rode out in front of his lines preparing to move, he saw his friend Lucius Polk being carried off the field. He talked with him, finding that the wound was not so serious, and was about to open his mouth when the men saw their divisional commander's head whipped to the right. A minie-ball pierced his left cheek, smashed 2 teeth in his lower jaw, and exited his open mouth. He fully intended to lead the attack, but found that the blood pooling up in his mouth kept him from speaking. He turned over command to Preston Smith and went to the surgeon to get his cheek sewn up. He wasn't with the division when they broke through the Union line, nearly capturing the entire Federal force. Kirby Smith rewarded Cleburne's men with a day of rest and new sky blue trousers from the captured enemy supply wagons. Cleburne would convalesce in the home of a local farmer. Although the wound wasn't life-threatening, the swelling and bleeding made eating difficult and speech impossible. Up until this point, Cleburne had been clean-shaven, but when he arrived back in camp at the end of September, he was sporting facial hair. For one, it was too painful to shave around the sensitive area, and two, it concealed the scar on his cheek. His speech was impacted as well. His men commented that it made him sound harsher, and one soldier described his raised voice as making a hissing sound. Confederate forces were spread all over the state of Kentucky, acting almost as an army of occupation rather than anticipating a major battle. When the Union Army under Don Carlos Buell began to move, Cleburne and the other outstretched units were recalled. Patrick's brigade and the division to which he was attached under Simon Bolivar Buckner was near Perryville, Kentucky. On October 8th, Cleburne and the rest of the division occupied the center of the Confederate line on the bank of Doctors Creek. Bushrod Johnson's brigade of Buckner's division went in first. After a devastating fire, Johnson's men ran low on ammunition. At 4 p.m., Cleburne's men were ordered forward. As they began to crest the ridge across the creek, they received artillery fire from the rear. The Confederate artillery mistook their blue trousers and blue battle flag as that of the enemy. Cleburne got the gunners to stop and the brigade proceeded up the ridge. After they topped the ridge, Cleburne and the other Confederate brigades helped break up the Union line with a charge, but in the confusion, the units became disorganized, and Cleburne halted them so they could reform. Union artillery began to shower the Gray troops from the left, and a shell killed Cleburne's horse and wounded him in the leg. He extricated himself from the horse and led an advance on foot despite the wound. Cleburne's brigade had advanced too far forward, and the threats to his flanks forced him to slow down the attack. Plus, it was beginning to get dark. Bragg had won a tactical victory, but had gained nothing strategic. Additionally, he had lost valuable manpower that was hard to replace. He decided to retreat out of Kentucky. Bragg had brought about 20,000 weapons to distribute to the thousands of new recruits that he believed would flock to his army, but had to carry them back out of the state. On the journey through the desolate Cumberland Plateau of Appalachia, many thought that the wagons loaded with the extra weapons would have to be discarded because it was difficult to traverse the mountain roads with them. Cleburne stepped in and organized parties of men to help the horses pull the wagons over the dangerous roads. On October 26th, Cleburne arrived in Knoxville, Tennessee. One of his biographers put it best when he wrote, "His ability to infuse his subordinates with enthusiasm, his eagerness for the offensive, and his personal courage and stubbornness in battle remain the principal hallmarks of his leadership." Even his success in taking charge of the wagon train during the retreat was largely a product of his personal energy and charisma. Cleburne had proven himself a great leader. It remained to be seen if he could also be a great commander. After making it to Chattanooga, Cleburne and the rest of the army moved into Middle Tennessee. During this time, Braxton Bragg reorganized the Army of the Mississippi and got it renamed the Army of Tennessee. Furthermore, Hardee's Corps got reorganized. Cleburne's division commander, Simon Bolivar Buckner, was assigned to command the garrison at Mobile, leaving a vacancy in the division. The other two brigade commanders were Sterling Wood and Bushrod Johnson. Wood had no military experience previous to the war, but Johnson had graduated from West Point, served against the Seminoles and in the Mexican-American War. Formally trained and an able commander, Johnson seemed to be the natural choice. However, the decision would be left up to the Confederate government and specifically President Jefferson Davis. Both Hardee and Bragg wrote letters of recommendation to the President for Cleburne to be given the rank of Major General and the commander of that division. Bragg wrote that he was young, ardent, exceedingly gallant, but sufficiently prudent, and the admiration of his command. With that, Cleburne became a Major General and a division commander in December of 1862. His brigade would be commanded by Lucius Polk. The new Major General would take on new responsibilities. His staff grew to include an Assistant Adjutant General, a Chief of Artillery, a Chief of Subsistence, and a Quartermaster, the head of his staff being Major Calhoun Benham, who had served under Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. All in all, his staff included 12 members. Not being a person well acquainted with all the roles that the staff performed, he mostly allowed his staff to operate with very little, if any, direct supervision. This also endeared him to his staff. Cleburne disdained the symbols of rank. He felt much more comfortable with the simple things rather than the elaborate and ornate. His staff hired a French cook at $40 a month to cook meals for them. Cleburne, being a more humble person and preferring more simpler tastes, ate the majority of his meals with the division medical officer, Dr. John M. Johnson. Another peculiarity with Cleburne was that he or his staff had a pet raccoon. At night, it would crawl under the covers of a member of the staff. Sometimes that officer might not want to have the company and kicked the animal out of the bed. The little raccoon would just find another bed to climb into. One night, the poor animal couldn't find a bed and began crying. One of the staff officers found it and brought it into his tent. Not only did Cleburne receive his appointment as Major General in December, but Davis visited the Army of Tennessee at Murfreesboro. Cleburne would not get to meet the commander-in-chief because he was 20 miles away, leading a column of troops against a federal force near Franklin, Tennessee. He probably wouldn't have liked all the celebration anyway. He was uncomfortable in those situations. For example, he did not attend famed Cavalier John Hunt Morgan's wedding or the large Christmas Eve ball held in Murfreesboro. He was content with sitting at his headquarters. As one of his biographers stated, he would rather lead a desperate charge against the enemy than engage in polite social conversation with ladies whom he did not know well. Also that winter, his youngest half-brother Christopher traveled through the lines from Cincinnati to Cleburne's headquarters to visit his brother. The young man, just 21 years old, would join Morgan's band of Cavaliers and throw his lot in for the South. As the end of December approached, Bragg's assumption that Union General William S. Rosecrans would not move out of Nashville was dashed. The Union Army was on the move against the Confederates around Murfreesboro, so Bragg had to recall his troops to concentrate against the enemy. Cleburne's men marched some 20 miles to rejoin the army. Then on December 30th, as it became dusky dark, his division took off their shoes, socks, and trousers in order to wade through the Cold Stones River. Once across, the 6,000 men were placed in their assigned locations by Cleburne and his staff. During the night, Cleburne met with the brigade commanders of McCown's division, who Patrick was supposed to support in their large swing against the Union right flank. It was well after midnight when Cleburne's men bedded down on the wet ground to get a little sleep before the dawn attack on December 31st. At dawn, McCown's division moved out with Cleburne's division right behind. They encountered the Union right flank, but once it was turned, McCown, instead of heading to the right, kept traveling to the left or further west. This opened up a large gap in the Confederate line. Cleburne filled it with his division, and as they kept pushing against the blue lines, other gaps emerged. Cleburne filled that gap with his divisional reserves. Near the Wilkinson Pike, he encountered some heavy resistance from Union artillery. He sent out his sharpshooters against those cannon crews, but they couldn't make any headway. So Cleburne called off the sharpshooters and ordered his artillery, who were able to silence a few of the guns, which allowed his infantry to move in. Part of the division attacked the backside of the slaughter pen and then moved north. Cleburne worked tirelessly to organize his division, which was spreading out on the east side of the battlefield. He chased the blue troops all the way to the Nashville Pike, but the Union line held when Cleburne advanced against it. All his troops could do was pull back to the tree line, but his advanced position without artillery made his position untenable. Cleburne's men slept on the ground without blankets, as most of them had discarded their packs to allow for more maneuverability and prevent being drugged down by the weight during the attack. When light appeared on the first day of 1863, Cleburne looked across the field between his troops and the Union soldiers positioned on the Nashville Pike. The field was strewn with rifles. Cleburne rode out into the field with sharpshooters taking careful aim at him and collected many weapons. His staff ventured with him, but at a much more timid pace. One of his staff members wrote that it reminded him of the goat that tried to knock a train engine off the track. He said, "I admired his spunk, but had very poor opinion of his judgment." For the rest of the day, Cleburne monitored the situation in his front until Bragg ordered him to move forward for a reconnaissance mission to find out if the Union Army was still there in strength. Cleburne sent in 2 brigades, but found the Union Army well entrenched and ready to fight. He reported as much to Bragg. For another night, the men slept on the ground without fires to keep them warm in the harsh winter weather. On January 2nd, Breckinridge's division launched their assault on the Union left, but it failed and Bragg ordered his forces to fall back. Just like at Perryville, Cleburne's men had relinquished the ground they had fought so hard to capture. It broke Patrick's heart to know that his soldiers, who had gave their blood and sweat to gain that ground, had to abandon it to the enemy. Bragg met with his commanders, and Bragg spoke openly about retreat. Polk and Hardee agreed, and the meeting ended. They sent the supply wagons to the southeast toward Tullahoma. Then, Bragg thought better of it and called his commanders to him to discuss the situation again, for the second time that day. He asked his corps and division commanders if the march could be postponed 24 hours, because if not, around 1,700 badly wounded soldiers unable to walk would be left behind. Cleburne spoke up and said that they could hold off an attack if it was made. Both Polk and Hardee explained that with the ammunition wagons already sent away, the army could not effectively fight an engagement. Cleburne changed his mind, and it was decided to not delay the retreat. Cleburne's men and much of his army did a forced march to Tullahoma, but although relatively safe from the Union Army, another threat came to the weary Confederates. Criticism of the retreat and Bragg circulated around the Confederacy and through the army. Bragg sent letters to his corps and division commanders and asked them two questions. One was whether Bragg resisted the retreat and that his commanders provided a consensus to retreat. This would help him in his standing in political circles and with the public. 2. Had he lost favor and confidence with his subordinates? He asked the men to be candid. Hardee came to Cleburne and they discussed how to proceed, and Hardee suggested that they truly be candid because this might oust Bragg from command of the army. Each division and corps commander wrote their letters. Cleburne stated that a retreat had been agreed upon and that the only resistance Bragg put forward was to postpone the retreat and nothing else. To the second question, Cleburne answered in the affirmative, that Bragg had lost the confidence of his commanders and troops. All the commanders said pretty much the same thing, except for Cheatham, who said that he was one of the first to suggest a retreat, but ignored the question of whether Bragg had lost confidence with the army. This irritated and enraged many of the commanders, because Cheatham was more than willing to criticize Bragg behind his back, but when given the opportunity to criticize the man to his face, he chose not to. Cleburne would make fun of Cheatham and tease him by telling him a story. It goes as follows. The report had been circulated among the beasts of the forest that the lion had a bad breath, whereupon as king the lion summoned all to appear, and admitted to them to his presence one by one. As each would answer upon smelling his breath that it was bad, the lion would devour him. When at length the fox was brought in, he replied to the question that he had a bad cold and escaped. The consultation with his commanders only convinced Bragg that he was a victim of a cabal. Ultimately, he had the confidence of Jefferson Davis, who supported Bragg more fully as politicians and commanders pushed for the Army commander's removal. Cleburne, at the behest of the Army commander when he asked for candid responses, had involved himself in Army politics, and those conflicts would continue in the months to come. The Army politics that centered around Braxton Bragg spilled over into the encampments around Tullahoma, Tennessee. Bragg wrote his official report of the recent battle and highlighted Cleburne as one of the stellar commanders on the field, but he pinpointed Generals McCown and Cheatham as inadequate. Cheatham had reportedly been drunk during the engagement, and McCown's failure to maneuver his troops in the proper direction led Bragg to arrest him for disobedience. Bragg named Cleburne as the senior officer overseeing McCown's court of inquiry. His selection seems odd because he witnessed firsthand the problems within McCown's division during the Dawn attack on December 31st. Therefore, his role in the inquiry was that of judge, jury, and witness. The court found McCown guilty and suspended him from service for 6 months without pay. He would never hold a significant position again. In Leonidas Polk's report of the Battle of Stones River, the bishop sent claims of admiration to Cheatham for a great performance in battle. Bragg became incensed at the praising of a commander whom he viewed as lacking in ability. He became convinced that a Polk-Cheatham alliance was attempting to dislodge him from his position. To combat this, Bragg drummed up old grievances. He charged Polk with disobedience when he refused to join Bragg near Frankfort on the Kentucky campaign and sent letters to his subordinates asking them to explain what they had done during this disobedience. Cleburne was sent that request but did not respond, just like Hardee suggested. To the thrill and disappointment of the Army and Cleburne, General Joseph E. Johnston visited the Army twice at Tullahoma. Each time, Hardee and Polk hoped that he came to replace Bragg, but Johnston left each time, leaving Bragg intact as commander. During Johnston's multiple stays at Tullahoma, reviews of the Army were organized and wagon loads of ladies were driven to the parade ground to watch the festivities. Cleburne enjoyed the reviews because it was essentially them drilling, and he wanted his men to be prepared for the next fight. During the early days of the Army's stay at Tullahoma, Cleburne received leave to visit Shelbyville, and his staff remarked that he returned refreshed. Patrick then took part of his staff to a waterfall just a few miles away from camp called Avoca Falls. The division commander suggested that they utilize the running water to get cleaned up. All 3 men doused themselves under the waterfall, then climbed back onto the bank to put their clothes on. Cleburne had got his socks wet and couldn't get his boots over them, so he jammed his bare foot into the boot and rode back to camp that way. His staff rode barefoot with their boots strapped to their saddles. During the 3rd week in April, the house that Cleburne used as headquarters caught fire and burned to the ground, but he and his staff were able to save most, if not all, the divisional records. April appeared, and so did the Union Army. Reaching out from its winter slumber around Nashville, Bragg detached Hardee's corps to Wartrace, Tennessee, named for an old creek warpath that went through the area. For the 2 months that Cleburne remained there, he and his men enjoyed a luxurious duty. Beef, mutton, fish, eggs, rolls, butter, coffee, and fresh strawberries were common at divisional headquarters. Corps headquarters was at a plantation home called Beechwood, owned by Colonel Andrew Irwin. The evenings at Beechwood were filled with commanders either gathering for simple social conversations or parties. Ladies from all over the area would descend upon the plantation. The colonel's sister-in-law wrote that, in a most homelike and social manner, the ladies refreshing them with charming music, both instrumental and vocal. Cleburne couldn't avoid attending these events since he was required to report to Hardee's headquarters. One of his biographers explained, 5 years earlier, he might have found these evenings almost intolerable. It was a measure of his growing self-assurance that now he could actually enjoy them. He was still relatively reserved, particularly compared with Hardee, who was energized by social activities and who was an outrageous flirt. On one occasion, as Hardee and Cleburne were riding to inspect Patrick's brigades, they came across a group of ladies. Hardee stopped to chat with the women. When Cleburne saw that the conversation was going to be a long one, he excused himself because he was in his work clothes, just a soiled shirt and no jacket. General Liddell remembered Patrick grumbling about Hardee running after women as he entered the tent. Cleburne went into his tent to don his uniform, but before he could come out, Hardee rode into camp. He asked Liddell where his wild Irish general was. Then he asked, is it not proper for a subordinate officer invited to ride with his commander to come properly dressed? Liddell answered in the affirmative. Cleburne emerged from the tent and Hardee exclaimed, now there is Cleburne, coming out so badly dressed as to be frightened home at the sight of ladies whom we happened to meet on the road. Cleburne explained that he left to allow Hardee to flirt more effectively. All 3 men laughed at the ribbing to one another and went about their business. It was also at Beechwood that Cleburne presented Hardee with a brand new uniform, making a large presentation of it to the corps commander during one of the parties, stating that since Hardee's uniform was ratty, he decided to buy him a new one. The crowd and the participants both knew the joke. Cleburne wore the uniform of a private most of the time and many times looked disheveled, especially compared to the dashing Hardee. While at Wartrace, Hardee organized many reviews and parades. Cleburne disliked the pageantry, but he was also self-conscious about his riding ability. He had never ridden a horse in Ireland and never owned one in Arkansas. He borrowed Dr. Nash's horse one day and returned on foot because of his lack of horsemanship. Thus, Cleburne preferred a more slow and plodding animal to ride. One of his soldiers described his mount as a clumsy old plow horse. Liddell's brigade was stationed at Bell Buckle, and it was there that he conducted a review of the troops for Colonel Arthur Freemantle of the British Coldstream Guards. Freemantle commented on the casual attire of the soldiers, but thought they drilled fairly well. While at Wartrace, Cleburne's division received 5 Whitworth rifles, a specialty rifle capable of hitting a target 3/4 of a mile away. He held shooting competitions to see who would be honored with the right to use the weapons. He personally instructed the men in their sharpshooting duties and could be seen on the front lines of a battle with his sharpshooters measuring their accuracy. As the year pushed on into summer, Ulysses S. Grant pushed against Vicksburg. Johnston, who was in Mississippi, was in need of reinforcements. Bragg, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of a detractor, sent Breckinridge and 2 of his brigades to aid Johnston. This left Hardee with Cleburne's division and one of Breckinridge's brigades. Bragg then detached Bushrod Johnson's brigade from Cleburne's division and combined it with what was left of Breckinridge's division and placed it under the command of Alexander P. Stewart. Cleburne was joined, however, by a new brigade, Churchill's Arkansas Brigade, who had been captured at Arkansas Post without firing a shot. This drew ire from the Army of Tennessee, who didn't want them in their division. As they attempted to set up their camp, the men from Arkansas were harassed by various groups, but it was Cleburne who welcomed them into his division and explained that nothing they did in the past would be held against them, only what they did in the future. Cleburne's troops held Liberty Gap in the center of Bragg's static defensive line, and as May moved into June, Rosecrans' Union forces were slowly moving toward the spread-out Confederate defensive line. The troops that Cleburne stationed at Liberty Gap became overwhelmed by an advancing Union force, and before Cleburne could mount an offensive against the approaching Federals, Bragg had ordered a retreat. The Irishman and his troops fell back, acting as a rear guard of the army as it crossed the Duck River. Along his path was Cheatham's division, and some of the divisional wagons had become disabled. Instead of moving them off to the side of the road, which was customary, they attempted to repair them on site. This infuriated Cleburne, and he ordered them to move, but they would not take orders from him. Patrick sent a letter off to Hardee, then he sent a letter off to Bragg, who ordered Polk to abandon the wagons that were disabled. The Army of Tennessee concentrated at Tullahoma, and Bragg contemplated engaging with Rosecrans' army there, but both Hardee and Polk agreed that the location would be untenable and to pull back further. Again, Cleburne and his troops left the ground to the enemy. He acted as the rear guard again for the army as they crossed Elk River and made it to Chattanooga. While the Army of Tennessee was moving toward Chattanooga, General Pemberton was surrendering to Grant at Vicksburg, and Robert E. Lee was leaving Pennsylvania defeated after the Battle of Gettysburg. Cleburne's division was tasked with guarding north of the city, where Bragg anticipated an attack to come from. The Army commander wagered that the Union Army would attack from that direction because Union General Ambrose Burnside was operating in Kentucky, and coordination between the two Federal forces seemed the most logical. Hardee left the corps in the hands of Cleburne when he traveled to meet with Bragg in Chattanooga. Cleburne became terribly stressed during this time as an acting corps commander, so much so that one of his staff commented that he would rather attack a line in his lair than approach Cleburne. The paperwork seemed overwhelming, and it was constant. The Irishman was energetic when it came to physical army duties, but he became utterly exhausted at the amount of paperwork expected of him. The situation would get worse for him because after a week of visiting with Bragg in Chattanooga, General Hardee was dispatched to Mississippi to provide help to Johnston. It was highly likely that Bragg hoped that once he got rid of Breckinridge and Hardee, that much of the attacks on him would stop, but that would not be the case. The new corps commander would come from the east, General Daniel Harvey Hill, who had known Bragg in the old army and was now one of his corps commanders. Hill spent a lot of time in Chattanooga conversing with the army commander, which left Cleburne in an acting role. Hill became disenchanted with Bragg as a commander. The constant advising done by Hill told the corps commander that Bragg did not have an overall strategy for the coming campaign. Conversely, Hill got along with Cleburne, and Cleburne treated Hill with the same respect as he did Hardee. While stationed above Chattanooga, Cleburne began to visit the Masonic Lodge in Tyner Station. The camaraderie and fraternal order gave him the inspiration to start a fraternal order for the Confederate armies, called Comrades of the Southern Cross. All free white males over the age of 18 who were serving or who had served in any of the Confederate armies would be welcome, and the dues paid would help support wounded veterans, widows, and orphans. He also hoped that it would foster camaraderie and patriotism between the serving Confederate soldiers. In late August 1863, Cleburne saw and heard Union soldiers working feverishly at various fords on the Tennessee River in his sector. As he peered through his field glasses at the blue troops, an artillery shell came soaring through the air and landed 3 feet in front of him, but didn't explode. The Irishman looked at the shell and then raised his binoculars back up to his face. This incident truly illustrates Cleburne's calmness when it came to combat. Despite the hard work of the Federal troops, it was all a ruse. Rosecrans' army crossed downriver on August 26th and was pushing east to cut off Bragg's line of retreat. The commander of the Army of Tennessee changed his mind multiple times even after having a council of war, but ultimately decided to retreat. On September 7th, Cleburne's division led the army south on the Lafayette Road, again abandoning more territory, this time the entire state of Tennessee. Since leaving Tullahoma, Cleburne's division had been reorganized. Liddell's brigade was no longer in his division, and Churchill had been sent to the Trans-Mississippi Department, although his brigade remained with Cleburne under the command of James Deschler. Sterling Wood's brigade remained in the division, and Wood himself had proved reliable in battle. Lucius Polk, who acted as Cleburne's right arm, was still with the division. Bragg knew that Rosecrans had to cross Lookout Mountain and utilize the gaps in the ridge to do so. Therefore, he wanted his divisions to trap part of Rosecrans' advancing army and defeat it in detail. Major General James S. Negley's division of George Thomas's corps traveled through Stevens Gap into McLemore's Cove, a prime target for the Confederate forces. On the night of September 9th, Bragg ordered General Heineman's division to attack the prone Union force and then ordered Cleburne's division to attack the Federal force in the rear. Cleburne set up his division at Dug Gap, ready to deliver a decisive blow whenever Heineman engaged the enemy. Bragg came to Dug Gap to watch the trap be sprung. As the day wore on, no sound of battle came from the direction of Heineman, and by now more and more blue troops filed into the cove. Bragg, in a fit of anxiety and restlessness, drove his spur into the ground, illustrating his frustration. The Irishman waited until after 4 p.m., when skirmishing was heard to the north. The division went into battle line and advanced into McLemore's Cove, but it was too late. George Thomas had pulled his troops back to the safety of Stevens Gap. The opportunity had been missed. For a week, Cleburne and his men remained at the gaps in Pigeon Mountain watching McLemore's Cove. The division commander slept on the ground in a thin blanket. One morning he woke up at dawn, stood, stretched, shook his blanket, and was startled to see a large rattlesnake drop out of it. On September 19th, Bragg ordered Cleburne to proceed with his division north to link up with the rest of the army. Covering over 6 miles, the Irishman's troops made it to the Confederate right near sunset, forming up behind St. John Liddell's men. Heavy fighting had already occurred that day, so the smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Liddell, now a division commander, rode up to Cleburne and urged him to attack, but Cleburne didn't know the ground and hadn't been given an order from his superiors to attack. When D.H. Hill approached, Liddell convinced the North Carolinian to send in Cleburne's division. Liddell looked at Cleburne and said, "General, I hope you will be quick, for a minute now will be worth an hour tomorrow." Cleburne assembled his division with Wood's brigade in the center, Polk's on the right, and Deschler's on the left. The division pressed onward through the ranks of Liddell's division, who gave them a cheer as they passed by. Cleburne took up a position right behind Wood's line, so that he could monitor the situation most effectively. The wings of the division moved through thick woods, but the center advanced through an open field. In that open ground, Cleburne commented that for half an hour the fire was the heaviest I had ever heard. The darkness and smoke made the musketry inaccurate. Many of the men simply aimed at the muzzle flashes of the enemy rifles. A member of his staff described Cleburne in the situation. "I never saw Cleburne before or afterward so demonstrative. I suppose knowing it was indispensable that the charge should be successful, and reflecting that his men had not seen a regular battle for 9 months, he deemed it necessary to encourage them as much as possible." Wood's brigade in the center, with lack of protection from the trees and hesitant to move forward without support on their flanks, called several halts and were slow in moving against the enemy. Cleburne ordered up his artillery under Major Hotchkiss and placed the cannon 60 yards from the Union infantry and opened with double canister. The blue troops fled and the Confederate division pursued, capturing 3 artillery pieces and 2 regimental colors. It was 9 p.m. and it became impossible to press the attack further. Hanley, one of Cleburne's staff members, rode up to a group of officers to deliver orders, but overheard them call out an order to an Indiana regiment. Hanley had unwittingly rode into Union lines. Quickly he wheeled his horse around and rode back into his lines without being discovered. Cleburne's men camped on the land they had conquered that night, without fires, although some did light them. Federal sharpshooters used the fire to pick their targets and send the gray troops running. In morbid fashion, the division slept on the cold ground in damp clothes from crossing the Chickamauga with dead Union soldiers. A couple of the men used the dead as pillows. During the night, Cleburne and his men heard the crack of axe blades against trees, and they knew that the next morning attack would involve overcoming Federal entrenchments. Behind the lines in thick foliage, Cleburne allowed a fire to be built at division headquarters. As he sat with his staff around it, some of the division officers brought in a captured lieutenant. Cleburne interrogated him as to the disposition of the Union Army, but the lieutenant wouldn't speak. Cleburne told the Confederate officer to take the prisoner away, and before he left the fire, the officer asked the lieutenant if he had anything to eat. The Federal said yes. The Confederate officer sighed and said he hadn't. The lieutenant said that there was some hardtack and other food in his haversack. The officer in charge of the prisoner and those soldiers who had made the capture scrambled for the food and began to bicker over who had the right to it. Cleburne intervened and said that it should be left up to the prisoner. The Union lieutenant said he would rather keep it. Cleburne gave a small smile and returned to the fire. Dawn emerged and Cleburne, Breckinridge, and Hill convened. They directed the men to draw rations and cook breakfast. A courier rode to the three men and said he was from General Polk and handed Cleburne and Breckinridge orders that said to attack the enemy when ready. The courier added verbally that it was supposed to be a dawn attack. By that point, that was out of the question, as dawn had already passed. Hill wanted to know why Polk was ordering his divisions forward, bypassing the chain of command. The courier explained that no one could find Hill the night before and decided to order the divisions in by order of General Bragg. The courier left and Polk arrived. Cleburne told him that they would move out as soon as the men ate. Polk acted as though the attack was nothing expedient and rode off. Next, Bragg approached, and he chastised Hill for his absence the night before and for not ordering the dawn attack. Nevertheless, a dawn attack was out of the question. At 9:30 a.m., Cleburne ordered his men forward. Polk's brigade on the right was supposed to keep contact with Breckinridge's division, which made the brigade move farther north, exposing the right flank of Wood's brigade. Polk's men made it to within 175 yards of the Union line when canister fire ripped into their ranks. They didn't go much further. Wood's men lay prone on the ground, unable to budge the well-fortified Union forces, and Deschler's men on the left were mixed in with Stewart's division and couldn't get untangled. Cleburne went to Deschler and sorted out the units. Stewart agreed to attack in tandem with Cleburne, but the Confederate regiments threw themselves against a greatly entrenched foe. Cleburne had no choice but to pull back. Deschler covered the withdrawal and remained within sight of the Federal guns from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. During that time, as Deschler paced up and down the line, encouraging his men to keep their heads down, but not to run, an artillery shell ripped him in half. At 3:30, Polk ordered Cleburne to move to the right to join Breckinridge as they assaulted George Thomas's line. The Union general was in the process of a staged withdrawal when Cleburne's men attacked at about 5 p.m. Earlier, General James Longstreet's men had busted through the Union center, and Thomas's men were some of the last holdouts of the Union line. Cleburne himself led an artillery battery to the precise location he wanted the cannons to be positioned, and directed its fire 60 yards away from the blue troops. One Confederate commented that the artillery scattered death and destruction into the ranks of the Federals. His infantry then moved in and captured the works, along with hundreds of prisoners and 3 artillery pieces. Hill called off pursuing the Federals, thinking it too dangerous to pursue so close to night. Exhausted, Cleburne's men bivouacked for the night where they stood. Out of the 5,115 men in the division, 1,743 were killed or wounded, or 1 out of every 3. Only 6 appeared to be missing. It had been a bloody and brutal battle for Cleburne and his division, but the divisional commander had emerged unscathed. Bragg did not follow up on his victory the next day as Union troops streamed over Lookout Mountain. He had reports from Nathan Bedford Forrest that Chattanooga was being evacuated and thus moved his army in that direction. But when he arrived, he found that the Union Army were digging in and fortifying the city. On September 24th, Cleburne was tasked with testing the Union lines and found that it was a formidable defense. Bragg decided not to attack and resolved to lay siege to the city. As the Army of Tennessee entrenched themselves against the Union Army occupying Chattanooga, Braxton Bragg sent off a series of charges against those commanders he deemed disobedient. First, he suspended Hindman for his act of disobedience at McLemore's Cove. Then he demanded to know from Polk why he had failed to launch the dawn attack on September 20th. Polk blamed Hill, but Bragg thought it was unsatisfactory. Hill was in his crosshairs as well for being disobedient at Chickamauga. The Confederate High Command got together and wrote a petition advocating for Bragg's removal as commander of the army. It was written by Simon Bolivar Buckner and addressed to the President. Nearly everyone signed the petition except for 2 of Bragg's biggest detractors, Breckinridge and Cheatham. St. John Liddell also refused to sign it. Cleburne was not fond of outward expressions of his opinions. He preferred to keep his thoughts to himself, but he was convinced to sign the petition as well. Instead of helping to oust Bragg from command, it gave the President and the Army commander a list of enemies. All of the troubles convinced President Davis to make a visit to the Army of Tennessee. In early October, he collectively met with Longstreet, Hill, Buckner, Cheatham, and Bragg. The 4 corps and division commanders agreed that Bragg was unfit for command, but the commander-in-chief wasn't convinced. The next day, Davis told Bragg he had confidence in him and to restore harmony. Bragg took this to mean that he could purge the army of those he felt was his enemies. The charges against Polk were dropped, but only if Davis agreed to send him to another command, which he did. Heineman received a pardon. Hill was targeted by Bragg and relieved of command. Hill fought for his reputation and wanted his day in court, so he assembled testimonies and the necessary paperwork to defend himself. Bragg accused him of disobedience for not advancing into McLemore's Cove on September 10th, when the roads were obstructed to prevent Cleburne's men from reaching the cove at the desired time. Bragg even requested that Cleburne write a letter defending the decision, and the Irishman upheld Hill's decision. Hill never got his day in court because Davis insisted the decision to remove him was administrative and Bragg didn't have a case. What this did was label Cleburne as one of the anti-Bragg commanders. This left 2 corps positions open. Bragg chose Breckinridge and Cheatham to head the 2 corps of the Army of Tennessee, and Longstreet commanded the divisions he brought with him from Virginia. Cleburne was able to demonstrate his ability as a field commander during the most destructive battles of the war in the Western Theater, and it was these examples of bravery and ability that led President Davis to declare him the Stonewall of the West. This was a humongous compliment because he was being compared to what many Southerners considered almost a demigod on the battlefield. For unknown reasons, but possibly because of Cleburne's poor opinion of Sterling Wood's actions during the recent battle, Wood resigned his commission. Liddell would be sent back to brigade command under Cleburne. Hardee would also return to the Army and take over corps command from Cheatham, who reverted back to divisional command. Bragg sent Longstreet north to Knoxville to deal with Ambrose Burnside and get Longstreet out of his hair for a time. As the Army of Tennessee perched atop Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, Longstreet requested another division to help get rid of Burnside, and Bragg obliged, not with 1 division, but 2. Cleburne's and Simon Bolivar Buckner's, at this point commanded by Bushrod Johnson, would be sent to Knoxville. Those 2 divisions marched to Chickamauga Station and began putting brigades of men on railroad cars destined for Knoxville. By mid-morning on November 23rd, Cleburne received an order from Bragg to halt putting any more troops on board. Not long after that, another message came stating to return the troops by rail to the station. Then a 3rd order came to Cleburne, and it said the army was heavily engaged and to return to Bragg's headquarters as soon as possible. Cleburne rode ahead, leaving the division under Lucius Polk to get the division on the road to Missionary Ridge, while their division commander got clarification from Bragg's headquarters. The army commander ordered Cleburne to the right along Missionary Ridge to a place called Tunnel Hill. Polk's brigade remained along the line of retreat to guard in case a withdrawal was needed. So at the moment, he had 3 brigades to guard Tunnel Hill. A detached rise just north of Missionary Ridge called Billy Goat Hill needed to be secured, but when Cleburne sent his Texans, William T. Sherman's troops had already taken the heights and the Confederates were pushed back to Missionary Ridge. A mistake by Sherman's men helped Cleburne. The blue troops thought Billy Goat Hill was Missionary Ridge, or at least part of it, and had stopped. Cleburne didn't have his division up, and if the blue troops had pressed on, it may have spelled disaster for the Southern forces. The delay allowed Cleburne to place the rest of his division. That same day, Lookout Mountain was captured, and Cleburne anticipated that Bragg would fall back, so he moved his artillery behind Missionary Ridge in preparation for a withdrawal. Then he sent a courier to Bragg's headquarters to find out the commander's decision. It was after 10 p.m. when Bragg, Hardee, and Breckinridge emerged from the headquarters, and the courier found out that the Confederates were going to defend Missionary Ridge. Cleburne then had to haul the artillery back on top of the ridge in preparation for a fight the next day. The next morning, Sherman launched numerous assaults against Cleburne, heavily outnumbering the single Confederate division. At one point, Union troops took cover in a defile where Confederate artillery and musketry could not reach them. Cleburne's men resorted to rolling boulders down the ridge, which prompted the blue troops to run, and then they would be shot in the back. Sherman's men reached Cleburne's line on a few occasions, but were thrown back each time. Before the fight ended, Cleburne's men launched a counterattack that sent back the blue troops. One of Cleburne's biographers explained it well when he stated, "For 7 hours against odds of greater than 4 to 1, Cleburne had used advantageous terrain, interior lines, and effective artillery fire to bolster first one threatened position, then another, repelling 3 separate assaults by a determined foe. As night fell, he could begin to feel confident that for this day at least, the enemy would not drive him from the ridge. However, he couldn't bask in the glory of victory for long. Although he had thrown back the Union assaults, the rest of the Confederate line had not, and a courier approached Cleburne and informed him that the center had given way. Hardee ordered Cleburne to use the 3 divisions still left on the ridge to hold the line until the army could withdraw. As he had been accustomed to doing, he acted as the rear guard of the army as it retreated. As the rear guard, he was tasked with protecting the wagons as well. The bridge over the South Chickamauga Creek had been burned, and Bragg wanted Cleburne to cross the creek and bivouac on the other side. Cleburne ignored the order, knowing that wading through the creek and sleeping on the cold ground might make the men sick or even kill some men. He ran the risk of being attacked with no line of retreat and bivouacked on the north side of the creek. During the night, Bragg ordered him to move to Ringgold Gap to help fight a possible Union threat. To help his men, he ordered a few men across the creek to build bonfires. Then his men stripped out of their clothes and waded across the river and got warmed on the other side while putting on their clothes. At Ringgold Gap, Cleburne assembled his division. He placed part of his artillery in a concealed position near the gap itself. When the Federal troops arrived, they advanced within 150 yards of the gap when Cleburne ordered the brush to be dragged away and the cannons fire. The canister fire ripped holes in the Union line, blunting the assault destined for their position. To the north end of Cleburne's line was the biggest concern. He had to reinforce and extend his line to meet the approaching Federals, but again, Cleburne and his division were able to throw back a force numerically superior than his own. Hardee informed Cleburne that the wagons had made it to safety and that he could withdraw. In a staged withdrawal, the division made it safely south, burning bridges to prevent the Union Army from pursuing effectively. They would go into winter camp near Dalton, Georgia. As Cleburne settled into winter quarters north of Dalton, Georgia, he began to construct a proposal that he had been thinking about since at least the spring. He looked around and saw that the Army of Tennessee could barely field 35,000 men, and all commanders began to call for more troops from the Confederate government. Conscription had brought thousands of men into the army, but more were needed, and the age range would be extended to encompass more men. Cleburne also took notice of the high casualties that the Confederacy suffered in battles and knew that those men were irreplaceable, even if victorious in battle. Therefore, he proposed enlisting slaves into the Confederate Army. For their service, they should grant the slaves their freedom, along with their families. He basically gave the South an ultimatum. They could either have independence or they could have slavery, but they could not have both. In April, he even mentioned it to his brigade commander, St. John Liddell, who was receptive to the idea. His staff was not receptive. In particular, his chief of staff, Calhoun Benham, was appalled at the proposal. He advised Cleburne to not bring these ideas to anyone else, but that would not deter Patrick. One of his artillery battery commanders, Captain Thomas Key, was brought into Cleburne's tent and asked whether he would support drilling and arming hundreds of thousands of slaves for Confederate service in the Confederate Army. Key argued that they could not be induced to fight and that they would make poor soldiers. Cleburne disagreed and believed they could be trained to fight as well as a white man. Key said that this would mean the end of slavery. Cleburne said yes, but wouldn't independence be more important? Key wrote in his diary that Southerners, including him, wouldn't agree with independence if it meant equality of the races. Cleburne was undeterred by the skepticism of his plan, and in December he brought the idea to his brigade commanders and regimental commanders. In all, around 14 men signed the proposal. At the beginning of December, Bragg left the Army of Tennessee. William Hardee took his place until a permanent commander could be chosen. 2 days after Christmas, Joseph E. Johnston took command of the Army. Cleburne took his proposal to Hardee and asked for a meeting with the Army's general officers. Hardee knew about the proposal and was skeptical, but he was good friends with Cleburne, and so on January 2, 1864, a memo went out to the officers to meet at Johnston's headquarters at 7 p.m. that night. Cleburne got up in front of the other officers and began his proposal. He started out by emphasizing that the Army needed manpower. He then described that the Confederacy could expand its conscription and have cooks and teamsters join the ranks as combat troops, but then the speech took a turn. He said that using those gentlemen would take skilled white laborers away from important jobs. He then made his revolutionary suggestion that they should offer freedom to slaves who fought for the Confederacy and the freedom of their families. He stated that, as between the loss of independence and the loss of slavery, we assume that every patriot will freely give up the latter, give up the slave, rather than be a slave himself. He argued that by agreeing to this proposal, that it would nullify runaway slaves' reasoning for joining the Union Army and enlarging the enemy's numbers. He said that it could possibly create friendship between the Confederacy and England and France. Furthermore, he made no qualms about it. Cleburne knew it would hurt the institution of slavery itself, and concluded that, if then we touched the institution at all, we would do best to make the most of it by emancipating the whole race. He knew that detractors would argue that that would make the Southern economy crumble, so he countered it by saying that African Americans were not the only ones who could do the hard, laborious jobs, that the hard duty performed by the Confederate soldiers demonstrated that whites were just as capable of hard labor in the Southern environment as African Americans. A pre-planned rebuttal was then given by Calhoun Benham. When the proposal and rebuttal was done, the floor was opened. Cleburne did not receive a warm reception. Many officers made emotional attacks against his proposal. The three that stand out as the harshest were those by William Bate, Patton Anderson, and W.H.T. Walker. Bate declared that Cleburne's proposals were hideous and objectionable, and he branded them as nothing less than the serpent of abolitionism. He thought the whole army would mutiny if that action was taken. Anderson called it a monstrous proposition that was revolting to Southern sentiment, Southern pride, and Southern honor. He was shocked that such a proposal came from a man whom he considered one of our bravest and most accomplished officers, and feared that it would bring down Cleburne the universal indignation of the Southern people and Southern soldiers. Walker was the most offended, asserting that the proposal was nothing less than treason, and that any officer advocating it should be held fully accountable. Cleburne did not argue his point. He was surprised and disappointed at the hostile responses that he got from his fellow officers. Johnston told the group that Cleburne's proposal would not be sent to Richmond and ordered the men not to speak a word of it to anyone. Walker approached Cleburne, wanting a copy of the proposal so that he could send it to President Davis, defying Johnston's order. Walker wanted to bring the authority of the president down upon Cleburne for suggesting what he and others believed as a treasonous act against the Confederacy. Cleburne had a clean copy wrote out for him, removing the names of the officers who had signed it to protect them from attacks by the president or any other political official, and gave it to Walker. Cleburne stood behind his proposal, even though he knew it would probably result in backlash. Out of those who knew about the proposal, some wrote about it in their diaries. One officer said, "If slavery is to be abolished, then I take no more interest in our fight." Cleburne had badly misread his audience and Southern society. In summarizing a statement by historian James McPherson, the South saw liberty and slavery as inseparable. Thomas Heineman wrote to Johnston about Walker's disobedience to the order to keep the proposal secret. Walker was able to hand off his copy to a congressman who took it to the president. Jefferson Davis was being hit by political barbs from politicians from all over the South that he had undercut traditional Southern values by overseeing a powerful centralized government. Davis did not want the issue of arming slaves to proliferate. Such a controversial topic could tear the Confederacy apart, so he ordered James Seddon, the Secretary of War, to issue an order suppressing any discussion of the matter. In the letter, he stated that such matters and subjects were not appropriate for military officers to consider. Cleburne himself was ordered to swear the junior officers to secrecy who knew about the proposal. During this turbulent January, Cleburne took part in lighter duty. After the January 2nd meeting, Hardee informed Cleburne that he was engaged and that he wanted Patrick to be his best man. They traveled from Dalton to Montgomery, then down to Mobile. During the wedding ceremony, the maid of honor, Susan Tarleton, caught the eye of Cleburne. They spent the next several days together until Cleburne's 2 weeks' leave was up and he had to return to the army. Before he left, he asked Susan to marry him. She didn't give him an immediate answer, but gave him permission to write her and promised that she would write him back. After a speedy courtship, Cleburne returned to his camp near Dalton. While the army had some downtime, Cleburne ordered the building of a log hut for the sole purpose as a staff officer school, where he met with his brigade commanders to discuss the art of war. He advised his brigade commanders to do the same with their regimental commanders. In late February, William Tecumseh Sherman was invading Mississippi and pushing toward the Alabama line. Leonidas Polk, scared that he could not fend off such a large attack, asked for assistance from Johnston. Johnston claimed that it was probably a diversion to take attention away from northern Georgia, but Jefferson Davis thought differently and ordered Johnston to send Hardee's corps, or half of his army, to Polk. The troops boarded trains for Mississippi, but when they got to Montgomery, Johnston ordered them back to Dalton because Federal troops were pushing southward. Cleburne returned as quickly as possible, but when he arrived, the threat had dissipated. Also, Sherman had turned back from Meridian, Mississippi. The army settled into winter quarters again, but Cleburne was on the move. For 3 years he had not taken leave, but now he had taken 2 within 6 weeks. He traveled to Mobile to see Susan. After a discussion, Susan agreed to marry him. On March 12th, he traveled back to Dalton. On March 22nd, 5 inches of snow had fallen and covered the ground. The men were excited to play in the snow. In fact, Cleburne led Lucius Polk's brigade, his old brigade, in an attack with snowballs against Govan's brigade. In the fight, Cleburne was captured. After a short deliberation, they decided to parole the general. Cleburne then joined the fight again, leading Polk's brigade into battle. He was captured a second time, and the captors had a longer deliberation on how to deal with a soldier who broke the rules of war. At first, they called for Cleburne's old punishment, to make him carry a rail for a mile, but an advocate stated that since this was his first offense, they should parole him again. Cleburne returned to his lines, and the snowball fight ended. On March 31st, Johnston organized a sham battle, pitting Cleburne and Bates' divisions against Cheatham's and Walker's divisions. They fired a half-dozen blank cartridges at one another, partially to keep the men trained and drilled in the art of loading and firing the rifled muskets, and partially to entertain the ladies who had ridden out from Dalton to view the army. That night, the men dined on peaches and cornbread. The first week in April, Johnston held a review of the army. Cleburne led his 7,000-man division in a stunning review in front of a crowd of ladies who rode out from Dalton. Johnston knew that the drilling and marching would prepare the men for the spring campaign season. Just 20 miles away, William T. Sherman was preparing his men for his campaign to capture Atlanta. On May 8, 1864, Cleburne rushed his men to the sound of battle at Dug Gap, west of Dalton, Georgia. A small band of infantry and cavalry were holding off an advancing Union column, but they needed assistance. Cleburne ordered forward Granbury and Lowry's brigade to the Gap. Granbury arrived first and deployed into battle. Hardee was with Cleburne, but at sundown, when the situation looked to be under control, Hardee left to report to Johnston. Cleburne and his men slept on the ground, Cleburne with only his saddle blanket to sleep on. The men had thrown off their knapsacks and blankets to make the march more quickly. The next day, Joseph E. Johnston's lack of effective cavalry reconnaissance made for a confusing day. The cavalry under Joseph Wheeler was to the north, fighting with Union cavalry and not informing the army commander of where Sherman was moving next. Cleburne was asked to ascertain whether the enemy in his front were even still there, or if they were they at full strength? Cleburne could not answer because that was the job for mobile cavalry units, not the slow-moving infantry he had. At midnight, Cleburne got word from Hardee and Johnston that Sherman may be moving further south to cut the rail line at Resaca, so he formed up his 3 brigades and marched 5 hours to Resaca. On the way there, the men reclaimed their knapsacks, but found that the contingent that they had relieved at Dug Gap had taken the food out of their knapsacks. Irritated and hungry, they made it to Resaca only to be ordered to countermarch back to Dug Gap. Another 5 hours of marching brought them right where they had started. General Hood had been sent to Resaca as well, and when he arrived he thought the situation safe from Union threat. That is why Cleburne was ordered to return to Dug Gap. However, Hood was wrong, horribly wrong. When Hood discovered this, Cleburne and his whole division was ordered back to Resaca. On May 11th, at 7 a.m., Cleburne moved out. When he made it to the town, his men threw up breastworks and prepared for a fight. All he found was Federal cavalry, but that force was testing how far up the roads the Confederate infantry were. General McPherson's Union infantry were filing through Snake Creek Gap, but he waited on Sherman to decide whether to move on Cleburne's men or not. Johnston, despite his lack of information about where the army was, concentrated not only his Army of Tennessee west of Resaca, but now he had Leonidas Polk's Army of Mississippi, bringing his total strength to about 60,000 men. However, Sherman still outnumbered him. Cleburne and his division occupied the direct center of the Confederate line, Sherman attacked the flanks and left the center for the most part alone. The Union commander had used those assaults to freeze the Confederate army in place while he maneuvered further south. Johnston, trying to halt Sherman's advance toward Atlanta, ordered a retreat. His men had defended their positions, but their supply line was being threatened. Once again, Cleburne was called upon to be the rear guard, and he held off pursuing the Federals until the Army of Tennessee made it south of Adairsville. Johnston divided his force when the road forked. Hardee's corps and Cleburne moved toward Kingston, and Polk and Hood moved to Cassville. He hoped Sherman would divide his force too, and then he could use Polk and Hood to crush the half confronting them while Hardee defended his position. It worked. Sherman divided his force, but miscommunication ruined Johnston's plan, and the army again moved south. Over the course of 2 weeks, the army had withdrawn halfway to Atlanta, a significant city for the production of war materials. In the Allatoona Mountains, Johnston's army rested for a few days. Cleburne wrote letters to Sue Tarleton and received her letters to him. However, he would be saddened to discover while stationed there that his youngest half-brother Christopher, who had joined John Hunt Morgan's command, had been killed in a battle at Dublin, Kentucky. Sherman was attempting another flanking maneuver, and Johnston was determined to stop it. At the engagement soon to be known as the Battle of Pickett's Mill, Cleburne's division was placed in reserve behind Thomas Hindman's division on the far right of the Confederate line. Skirmishers began reporting more and more Federals massing on their right. Cleburne sent one brigade to extend Hindman's line, but more reports came pouring in. Soon, Cleburne had repositioned his entire division, not behind Hindman, but to his right, becoming the extreme right flank of the Confederate Army. This was going to be one of the main attacks ordered by Sherman. If Cleburne hadn't perceived the threat to his right, the large Union assaulting columns, stacked multiple ranks deep, would have slammed into the exposed Confederate flank and possibly spelled disaster for Johnston's army. As the blue troops approached, General Granberry of Cleburne's division yelled for his men to fix bayonets. They did, and prepared for hand-to-hand combat. For hours upon hours, Cleburne's men held against the Union onslaught. General Lowry's brigade, Cleburne's only reserve, were called into action by the Irishmen, who placed them on the extreme right as the Federals began to swing around again. Cleburne was reported to be extremely calm as the chaos of battle raged around him. Bullets whizzed by and artillery exploded in the air, but Cleburne never flinched. As sundown came, sporadic shooting remained. Granberry, who was asked by Cleburne to send out his skirmishers to see if the Federals were still close, asked permission to use his entire brigade. Cleburne agreed, and Granberry's men with fixed bayonets charged into the darkness, taking fire at point-blank range, but driving the Federals away from their position and taking 200 prisoners. As morning broke, one Confederate described the ground in front of his position as having a blue carpet spread out over it because of all the Union dead. The Federals claimed that they had lost about 1,600 men, although Cleburne estimated they lost around 3,000. Cleburne's division had only lost 85 killed and 363 wounded. Cleburne's division was gaining a reputation in the Army as being invincible. Over the next week, both armies stretched back to the main rail line that Johnston was trying to protect and Sherman was attempting to capture. Over that week, Cleburne fought a cold and diarrhea as constant skirmishing took place on his lines. The next week saw 2 casualties that impacted Cleburne. On June 14th, an artillery shell killed General Leonidas Polk. William Loring, the senior division commander in Polk's corps, took temporary command of the corps, but a week later, Alexander P. Stewart of Hood's corps would take permanent command. Stewart's placement is curious, not because he wasn't a capable commander, but he was 6 months a junior to Cleburne as a major general, and he did not have the amazing record that Cleburne had. Additionally, Stewart was West Point trained, but it is believed by historians that Cleburne's suggestion of arming slaves held him back from getting that position. The day after his uncle was killed, Lucius Polk's position was hit with heavy artillery fire, and his horse was killed by a shell, which mangled his legs and ripped away a large section of his calf. Cleburne rushed to his close friend and asked how badly he was hurt. Polk knew how stingy Cleburne was with giving furloughs and replied, "Well, I think I'll be able to get a furlough now." It was a little bit of comedic relief amidst the horrors of war. Polk would have to resign from the Army in July, not being able to perform adequate service because of his injury. Instead of appointing a new brigade commander, his brigade had been so depleted because of the constant battles that it was decided to disperse the regiments throughout the division. Johnston positioned his army on Kennesaw Mountain, and Cleburne prepared his men for an assault. Again, his men were going to be in the thickest of the fighting when George Thomas, under orders from Sherman, arrayed 5 brigades one behind the other with fixed bayonets and charged Cleburne's position. The entrenched Confederates were not only protected by their dug-in position, but by abattis and chevaux de frise. If the Union defenders could make their way across all those obstacles, then the leveled rifled muskets of Cleburne's division awaited them. For over 4 hours, Cleburne's division fought off the Union onslaught. On a few occasions, the blue troops made it to the gray lines, but were thrown back each time. Near the end of the fighting, muzzle flashes had ignited the dry underbrush, and the Union wounded were beginning to burn alive. The wounded called out for help, and when they did, Major William H. Martin of the 1st Arkansas tied a white handkerchief to a ramrod, stood on the ramparts of the trenches, and yelled to the Federal troops that this was butchery to cease fire until their wounded were dragged to safety. Over the next few moments, both Union and Confederate soldiers drug and carried as many of the wounded as possible to safety before they burned alive. Once the job had been completed, the two sides went back to fighting. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was an unquestionable Confederate victory. In front of Cleburne's division, those Federals lost about 300 killed and over 500 wounded. Cleburne's division lost only 2 killed and 9 wounded. On July 19th, Cleburne received word from Hardee that Johnston was relieved and Hood would take his place. Hood, Stewart, and Hardee asked Johnston to stay in command until the fight for Atlanta had been decided, but Johnston said he was a soldier and he would obey orders. Hood's placement as Army commander was a slap in the face of Hardee, who was the senior corps commander and who had been entrusted with the Army before Johnston arrived to take command. Hood now needed to name a new corps commander. He didn't think his division commanders were capable of commanding a corps, so he approached Hardee and asked which one of his division commanders should be placed in that position. Hardee recommended Cheatham. This was strange, and we may never know why he chose Cheatham over Cleburne. Over the years, historians have postulated that Hardee didn't want to lose Cleburne as a division commander. Some have even suggested that since Cleburne took no initiative in councils of war or offered his own opinions, that he was unable to exercise that type of independent command. Hardee did place his headquarters near Cleburne. Was that because of friendship, or did he believe that Cleburne needed oversight? Many point to Cleburne's proposal to arm slaves as the reason that he was not given corps command. No matter the reason, Cheatham was chosen, and Cleburne would remain a division commander. John Bell Hood took over from Joseph E. Johnston, and the young general knew what the President of the Confederacy expected of him. Johnston fell back, but Hood would attack. One of his first offensives came at Peachtree Creek, where Hardee's Corps and Stewart's Corps were to attack Union troops commanded by George Thomas. Cleburne was kept in reserve until word came to Hood and Hardee that the Confederate right flank was in danger. Hardee immediately sent Cleburne to relieve the forces of Joseph Wheeler, who was barely holding off the Union assaults. Cleburne's men arrived near midnight, and unable to see the terrain or make out the enemy positions in the dark, Wheeler's men whispered to the infantry that the slightest noise would cause the Federals to open up their artillery and musketry. When the cavalry pulled out, the infantry took their place, but they found no breastworks or fortifications. They were forced to stab their bayonets into the hard ground to dig up dirt in order to create rifle pits. The digging made enough noise that a Union battery not far from Cleburne's position opened up at close range. In the darkness, they hadn't realized how close the enemy actually were. Nearly 40 men were obliterated by the artillery blasts. Cleburne's men worked feverishly to construct entrenchments, and by the next morning, the Union resumed their attacks. The cavalry to Cleburne's right fired one volley and ran away, forcing Cleburne to use his reserves to extend his flank. However, that was not enough. He sent word to Hood to send him reinforcements. Cheatham's old division, now commanded by George Maney, secured his flank. Night finally came, and Cleburne's men were ready for a reprieve. They had been fighting all day. Cleburne commented to Hardee that it was one of the hardest fights he had ever been in. But as darkness set, word came to Cleburne to abandon his position that he had worked tirelessly to defend. However, the withdrawal wasn't to rest, it was to be used in another attack. The men marched into Atlanta and took a short break while Cleburne conversed with Hardee. Hood approached Hardee and informed the Corps commander of his orders. Hood wanted Hardee to do a roundabout march, some 15 miles by dawn of the next morning, and attack a Federal column moving toward Atlanta. The men had barely slept in 2 days and had seen hard fighting all of those days. This would be a Herculean task. For 48 hours, the men of Hardee's corps had fought or marched. Hardee let them sleep for 2 hours while he, Cleburne, and the rest of the division commanders strategized. Cleburne and Maney would be on the left, while the other brigades would be on the right. The men didn't get into position until nearly midday, and the horrendous summer heat beat down on the gray-clad troops. The assaulting Confederates completely surprised the Union troops, catching them off guard. Cleburne's men moved deep into the Union lines, and a few soldiers saw an officer on horseback. They called to him to halt and surrender. According to the gray infantryman, the officer touched his hand to his hat and then wheeled about to ride off. The Southern men fired a volley into the man. The officer turned out to be Major General James B. McPherson. The attack was initially successful, but the heat caused many soldiers to pass out from heat stroke. Nevertheless, they continued to attack. General Govan requested support, and Cleburne told one of his aides to find General Lowry and tell him to support Govan. On his way to find the other brigade, the staff officer saw that a gap was forming between Cleburne's division and Walker's division. The aide approached Lowry and informed him of Cleburne's orders, but also told him about the gap. Lowry filled the gap instead of assisting Govan. When Cleburne heard about this, he was pleased. He was never in favor of blind obedience. If his subordinates saw a problem or an opportunity, he had taught them to disregard his orders and take action if it assisted or helped the overall situation. His relationship with his subordinates was more of a relationship than a hierarchy. Instead of assisting Govan with Lowry, he ordered up an artillery battery to blast away at the stubborn Federals. When the artillery commander reported that the Union troops had pulled back, Cleburne gave a big smile and yelled, "Generals to the front!" He spurred his horse and rode with his men into the Union lines on Bald Hill, but after 45 minutes of fighting, Cleburne could not dislodge the 3rd Union line, so his division, along with Maney's, settled into the second set of entrenchments that they had captured and dug in. Hood's plan was for Hardee's corps to strike the flank of the Union Army. Then he would send in Cheatham's corps to land a decisive blow. However, Hood held Cheatham back, hoping that Hardee could move more of the Union line north so that Cheatham's attack could be more destructive to the enemy. By not ordering Cheatham to support Cleburne at the critical moment, the opportunity was missed, and when Cheatham's corps did make their attack, it yielded no significant result. Although Hood declared the Battle of Bald Hill as a victory, at best it was indecisive. Hardee reported 3,299 casualties. About 40% of those casualties were from Cleburne's division. The 1,388 casualties suffered in Cleburne's brigades in that one battle was more than all the previous battles of that campaign combined. On top of that, the attacks had removed many officers from field command. 30 of his 40 field-grade officers in his division had become casualties. 8 of the 15 regimental commanders in the division were killed or wounded. Lowry's brigade lost 578 men out of the approximately 1,000 men he took into battle. As he said, his brigade was cut to pieces. Hood now brought his forces into the fortifications of the city. Around this time, General Stephen D. Lee, a distant cousin of Robert E. Lee and just 30 years old, took command of Cheatham's corps, forcing Cheatham back to divisional command. After W.H.T. Walker's death, his division was broken up and the brigades were distributed among the rest of Hardee's corps. Cleburne received Mercer's brigade, commanded by Charles Olmsted. It had seen light duty by garrisoning Savannah, but had been thrown into the Army of Tennessee when manpower became a larger problem. Cleburne wrote to Hardee that the untested nature of the new troops to his division was unsettling to him, and that their commander was inefficient. On August 30th, reports came to Hood that a strong Federal column was near Jonesboro. The Army commander called Hardee to his headquarters, and Cleburne was to lead the corps to Jonesboro. Along the march, Cleburne rode ahead and found Federal infantry guarding a bridge along his route. Knowing that he needed to get to Jonesboro quickly, instead of deploying to fight the enemy, he took his men on a different route and avoided the enemy entirely. His staff noticed that Cleburne was visibly anxious. He didn't know how large of a force awaited him at Jonesboro, and his troops were marching through the night. It was daylight before Cleburne's troops made it to the destination, and Hardee, along with Stephen D. Lee's corps, joined him. Hardee asserted control over both corps, allowing Cleburne to command Hardee's corps during the impending battle. Nearly 20,000 Union soldiers were entrenched in a semicircle with their flanks anchored on the Flint River. Cleburne was to swing northward, and once heavily engaged, Lee's corps would attack the Union front. The plan was similar to the way Bragg had envisioned the Battle of Stones River plan out. Cleburne had personally seen the problems that arose in such an attack when the front line did not move in the designated direction. His division had to close up the gap when McCown's division moved west instead of north. He instructed each of his divisions to dress to the left in the attack and drive the enemy across the river. Major General George Maney, a veteran of the Army of Tennessee's bloodiest battles, misunderstood the orders and ordered his men to dress to the right in the attack. The Confederates stepped off at 3:30 p.m., and the first elements of the enemy the corps encountered were dismounted cavalry. When those troops began to run, Cleburne's division, commanded by General Lowry, pursued after them to the east instead of pressing north. This left Brown's division and Maney's division to attack the Union position alone. Maney, when he saw Lowry's men move east, attempted to fill that gap with a few of his own brigades, but this took troops away from the reserve that was to exploit a breakthrough. That was not the limit of their troubles. Cleburne had to pull his corps back because the attack was so disorganized. What he didn't know was that Lee, instead of waiting until Cleburne was fully engaged, attacked an hour before Cleburne ever moved to make the attack. The frontal assault resulted in a bloody firefight that gained no ground. Hardee had no choice but to pull his troops back. The next day, on September 1st, Cleburne knew what to expect. Union troops filed to his right in their new position. Many of the Southern soldiers admitted that it was a poor position, but the men had dug in as best they could. Wave after wave of blue troops surged towards Cleburne's division, the hinge of Hardee's corps. Lee's corps had been ordered north to Atlanta, so there was no help for Hardee. Govan's brigade took the brunt of the attack, but it was getting ready to break. Govan's men swung their muskets like clubs, the artillerists plied their ramrods. Sweet's battery continued to fire even as the Yankees swarmed over the works. A soldier in the 1st Arkansas wrote, "We were surrounded and fought in front and in the rear, fought as General Cleburne always fought." An aide rode up to Cleburne and informed him of the breakthrough. Hardee overheard and sent the corps' reserves, Vaughan's Tennessee Brigade. Cleburne personally led them to the breakthrough and mended the battle line. However, Govan and nearly his entire brigade had been captured. As night fell, Hardee knew that remaining on the battlefield would spell disaster for his corps. Now, Sherman's troops were in between Hardee's corps and Atlanta. The Confederates began to march south in the darkness. As the depleted ranks of Hardee's corps traveled further and further away from Atlanta, they could hear the muffled explosions of Hood destroying war materials in the city that could not be brought with the Confederate Army. The Army of Tennessee met up near Jonesboro, south of Atlanta. Cleburne's men were bloodied from the constant fighting over the last few months. They rested for the first time in a long time while the army licked its wounds. Cleburne had lost 3 important men in his division at the Battle of Jonesboro. One of his staff officers was severely wounded, and the other one, Calhoun Benham, resigned in despair and headed for Mexico. General Govan and much of his brigade had been captured. Hood blamed everyone but himself for the failure to defend Atlanta and asked for Hardee to be reassigned to another army. On September 15th, the governor of Georgia declared a day of prayer and fasting. On that day, one of Cleburne's brigade commanders, General Lowry, who was a Baptist preacher, preached a sermon to the division in a large stand of poplars and oaks. Cleburne wouldn't be without Govan for long. An unusually quick prisoner exchange resulted in Govan and his 600 men coming back into the division, bringing the total number of troops under Patrick to 3,290. In late September, President Davis came to visit the army. He made speeches to multiple units, but when he and Hood rode by part of Cleburne's division, they started chanting for Johnston. That night, a staff officer came into camp and informed the men not to chant that because it hurt General Hood's feelings. While the president was with the army, Hardee again asked to be transferred or have Hood deposed as army commander. Davis didn't want to get rid of Hood, so he transferred Hardee. Cleburne was devastated and contemplated submitting his resignation as well. He said he would rather be an officer on Hardee's staff than a divisional commander under Hood. However, loyalty to his division led him to decide against resigning. Again, a corps command position came open, and instead of assigning Cleburne to lead Hardee's corps, Benjamin Cheatham was again chosen over him. It was around this same time that Cleburne approached Hood about obtaining a 2-week furlough. He wanted to return to Mobile to be married, but Hood simply shook his head and told him that the campaign season was still ongoing, and that he couldn't spare any general for the upcoming campaign, let alone Cleburne. When Susan received the letter from Patrick informing her that he would not get leave to marry her, she shut herself in her room and cried all day. She confessed to a friend that the constant worry about Cleburne during the Atlanta campaign had severely weakened her health. The Army of Tennessee marched north. With rations running low, the Confederate soldiers were tempted to scavenge off the land. Cleburne, riding ahead of his division, caught a group of soldiers picking apples near the roadside. Damage in property was against General Hood's orders, so Cleburne told the men to sit the 6 bushels of apples along the road. When the division commander sat on a fence and began to smoke his pipe, General Granbury's brigade arrived at the location. As Granbury rode up, Cleburne addressed him. "General Granbury, I am peddling apples today." Adopting his mood, Granbury replied, "How are you selling them, General?" Cleburne responded, "These gentlemen have been very kind. They have gathered the apples for me and charged nothing. I will give them to you and your men. Now you get down and take an apple, and have each one of your men pass by and take one, only one, mind, until they are gone." His entire brigade marched by in single file, each man picking up an apple as he passed. The men offered a hurrah for old Pat and smiled at the guilty party. Once the apples were gone, Cleburne ordered each of the guilty men to carry a rail for a mile before returning to their unit. Once the men got just south of Dalton, Hood ordered his men to destroy the railroad tracks. Cleburne's division did not have the tools to properly deconstruct the rail lines, so Cleburne had his men line up and down the rail, and at the signal, they would pick up the ties and rails and essentially flip them over. This made them easier to tear apart. Once the rails were tore away from the ties were stacked in piles and set ablaze. Then the rails were put over the burning ties until malleable. Then the soldiers twisted them around telegraph poles, calling them Mrs. Lincoln's hairpins. The men arrived at Dalton, where a garrison of 750 Union soldiers, about 2/3 of them being new black recruits, were stationed. Cleburne's men formed into battle line in front of the fortifications as Hood asked for the garrison's surrender. The Union commander asked that his black troops be treated like white troops, but Hood said that was up to the War Department, not him. The Union commander complained that once the surrender had taken place, his black troops were tormented by Cleburne's division. Cleburne would transfer the prisoners to the engineers, who formed them into gangs to help destroy part of the railroad. After that, the army moved west into Alabama to Tuscumbia, where Hood ordered a pontoon bridge built across the Tennessee River. It was constructed and Cleburne's men marched across on November 13th. Rains delayed the movement of troops on the campaign that Hood had planned to retake Nashville. Cleburne, meanwhile, gave patriotic speeches to his troops, attempting to lift their spirits. As one of Cleburne's biographers put it, did such behavior suggest that he was optimistic about the forthcoming campaign, or was it a manifestation of a determined fatalism? He was by nature quietly intense, and it would have been perfectly consistent with his fatalistic view of the world that as the prospects grew darker, he would feel compelled to assert his commitment more passionately. On their way north, the division passed by the plantation home of Lucius Polk. Cleburne was thrilled to see his dear friend again. However, they couldn't visit long, and Cleburne rode off with his division toward Columbia. Across the Duck River was 2 Federal corps commanded by John M. Schofield. Hood planned on using part of Lee's corps to hold them in place, and then swing the rest of the army north to cut off their retreat. On the march, Hood's 12-mile march turned into a 17-mile march, but the army made it to Spring Hill. A sizable force awaited the Confederate army at that town. Cleburne would be heavily involved in the attack. Hood wanted to maintain control of the turnpike that traveled between Columbia and Spring Hill. However, in the meeting with General Cheatham, the corps commander believed the objective to be the town, not the turnpike. Cleburne, along with General Nathan Bedford Forrest, would attack the Union defenders and outflank them, but 18 guns arrayed hub to hub would send his men back. Another attack by the majority of Cheatham's corps was to be made, but John C. Brown complained that his division could be too easily outflanked and failed to attack. His attack was to signal Cleburne to launch his own attack, so the day passed away into the night with neither division launching another assault. The Army of Tennessee then bedded down without holding the turnpike. Cleburne awoke the next day to find that the enemy in his front were gone, and even worse, the Union Army to the south of them had marched along the unguarded pike and made it to Franklin, Tennessee. The demoralized Confederate Army pursued. Grumbling throughout the Army command was getting louder as each general blamed the other for the failure. Cleburne made it to the Twin Hills flanking the turnpike just south of Franklin. There he sat down and enjoyed a game of checkers with one of his staff officers. Then the game was interrupted by Hood's orders to report to headquarters. In the parlor of the Harrison House, Hood outlined his plan for the day's attack. Cleburne reportedly stated, "I will take the enemy's works or fall in the attempt." Cleburne's staff and his subordinates noticed that when their division commander came to give them their orders, he was despondent. Usually their commander was excited to go into battle, but this time was different. General Govan said to Cleburne, "Well, General, there will not be many of us that get back to Arkansas." Cleburne responded by saying, "Well, Govan, if we are to die, let us die like men." Cleburne then went to a small knoll where Confederate sharpshooters were positioned and where he could get a good view of the ground that awaited him. He had left his field glasses behind, so he asked Lieutenant John Ozane of the sharpshooters if he could borrow a telescope. Ozane removed the telescope from his Whitworth rifle and handed it to Cleburne. He viewed the earthworks of the enemy and then said, "They are most formidable." He then rode off to organize his division. His men had to maneuver over nearly 2 miles, and he knew that every inch of ground would be contested by artillery and musketry. Cleburne rode along the ranks of his men, some who had followed him into battle since they left Arkansas. He told them to save their fire and to use the bayonet. It was 4 o'clock and sunset was approaching. Cleburne looked back toward Winstead Hill for the signal from Cheatham to advance. A signal flag was dropped, and Cleburne called out for his men to forward march. Nearly 20,000 men stepped off to make this attack. As they maneuvered over the terrain, Cleburne's head was on a swivel, making sure his division was in order and each was keeping pace with the other. An advanced Union line delivered a volley into Cleburne's men. Then the rebels gave a rebel yell and sent the Federals running for their main line. When they broke, General Brown to Cleburne's left yelled to Patrick that they will go into the works with them. Cleburne agreed and yelled to his men to go into the enemy's works with the running Federals. This would work to the Confederate advantage. The Union troops in the main line would not fire because their comrades would be in their line of fire. Here was the opportunity to break the Union line. It now became a race. Cleburne, still mounted, spurred ahead into the mass of men, charging diagonally across the front of his own brigades toward the center of the Union line. In mid-canter, his brown mare went down heavily, nose first, killed by rifle fire. Picking himself up, Cleburne called for another horse. A staff officer, Lieutenant James Brandon, rode up and dismounted quickly, offering the reins to Cleburne. Cleburne had one foot in the stirrup when this horse too fell to the ground, shot dead. Dropping the reins, Cleburne drew his sword and, waving it over his head, charged forward on foot toward the Yankee line, where he could see the men of his command clambering over the earthworks. Granbury and Govan's brigade had breached the enemy line. Cleburne ran toward the breach. 50 yards short of his goal, a single Union bullet penetrated his heart, killing him instantly. His men exploited the breach, but would be pushed back to the opposite side of the earthworks. With only the width of a trench line separating them, each side fired blindly at one another in the darkness. During the night, Schofield would move north. Cleburne was now one of thousands of bodies laying on the field at Franklin. The next morning, the morning sun revealed the grisly scene. A Mississippi soldier remembered when he found Cleburne. I and 2 others were the first to discover his dead body at early dawn the next morning. He was 40 or 50 yards from the works. He lay flat upon his back as if asleep, his military cap partly over his eyes. He had a new gray uniform. It was unbuttoned and open. The lower part of his vest was unbuttoned and open. He wore a white linen shirt which was stained with blood on the front part of the left side, or just left of the abdomen. This was the only sign of a wound I saw on him, and I believe it was the only one he had received. I have always been inclined to think that, feeling the end was near, he had thus laid himself down to die, or that his body had been carried there during the night. He was in his sock feet, his boots having been stolen. His watch, sword belt, and other valuables were all gone, his body having been robbed during the night. His body was placed on a litter and carried about a mile to Carnton, the McGavock plantation house. They laid him on the porch next to some of the other generals killed in the attack, like General Adams, Granbury, and Straw. From there, his body was sent south to Columbia and buried in Rose Hill Cemetery. Lucius Polk attended the small funeral of his former commander. He wasn't at ease about the place in which his friend lay. He remembered that on his way to fight at Franklin, Patrick had commented about the beauty of his plantation, so he decided to disinter him and reinter him near St. John's Chapel on Polk's plantation. Susan Tarleton heard of her fiancé's death 5 days after the battle. She would be consumed with grief and wear black for an entire year. She would eventually get married to a former Confederate captain named Hugh Cole in 1867, but she would die less than a year later from an effusion of the brain. Cleburne's friend and comrade, Learned Mangum, was not satisfied with his friend's resting place and raised the funds to move him to Helena. Lucius Polk, Benjamin Cheatham, Isham Harris, and Jefferson Davis walked in the public procession to the docks in Memphis, where the body traveled downriver to Helena. In that city, his body was finally laid to rest in Evergreen Cemetery in April 1870, exactly 20 years after he had arrived in that small frontier town.